The Korean War stands as one of the 20th century's most pivotal, yet overlooked conflicts. A 3-year struggle from June 25, 1950 to July 27, 1953, that claimed millions of lives, permanently divided a nation, and reshaped East Asian geopolitics. Despite its profound impact, this conflict has earned the designation the Forgotten War, overshadowed by World War II's triumph and Vietnam's trauma. This examination explores Korea's division, the war's outbreak, major battles, Chinese intervention, stalemate, and enduring consequences that continue shaping the Korean Peninsula and American foreign policy today. Do not let this crucial chapter remain forgotten. Read on to discover how this police action became a Cold War-defining moment, understand North Korea's nuclear crisis origins, and grasp the limited war patterns that continue influencing global military strategy. If you find this historical examination valuable, please subscribe to stay informed about important Cold War history. Like this video to help others discover these forgotten stories, and share your thoughts in the comments below. What aspects of the Korean War surprised you most? Your engagement helps preserve these vital historical lessons for future generations. The Forgotten War. Why the name? The Korean War, which lasted from June 1950 to July 1953, has been termed the Forgotten War in American and broader Western historical consciousness, a designation that encapsulates one of the most paradoxical aspects of 20th century military history. How a conflict that killed millions of people, involved multiple nations, threatened to escalate into World War III, and permanently divided a nation, could somehow fade into relative obscurity in the collective memory of the countries that fought in it. This moniker reflects a complex interplay of historical, cultural, political, and psychological factors that have conspired to relegate this brutal and consequential conflict to the margins of public awareness. Despite its profound impact on the Cold War, on East Asian geopolitics, and on the lives of millions of Koreans who continue to live with its consequences every single day. The name Forgotten War began appearing in the 1950s and 1960s, coined by veterans and commentators who noticed that their war was receiving far less attention, recognition, and commemoration than the conflicts that preceded and followed it. And this sense of neglect has persisted through subsequent decades, even as historians and Korean War veterans have worked to bring greater attention to the conflict and its significance. The fundamental reason the Korean War earned this unfortunate designation stems from its timing in relation to other major conflicts that dominated American and Western consciousness, creating a situation where the war was overshadowed both by what came before and what came after. World War II, which concluded just 5 years before Korea, had been a total war that mobilized entire societies, produced clear heroes and villains, ended with decisive Allied victory, and generated a massive cultural legacy through films, books, memorials, and commemorations that kept the war vivid in public memory for generations. The American public emerged from World War II with a sense of triumph and moral clarity, having defeated fascism and militarism in a struggle that seemed to vindicate democratic values and American power. And the war was memorialized through powerful symbols like VE Day, VJ Day, the raising of the flag at Iwo Jima, and the liberation of concentration camps that provided narrative closure and emotional resonance. By contrast, the Korean War lacked such clarity and closure. It began suddenly when North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel on June 25, 1950, catching many Americans by surprise and pulling a nation that had hoped to enjoy post-war peace and prosperity back into military conflict in a distant Asian peninsula that most Americans knew little about and could barely locate on a map. President Harry Truman's decision to characterize American involvement as a police action under United Nations auspices, rather than seeking a formal declaration of war from Congress, further diminished the conflict's perceived significance Even though the fighting was just as deadly and the stakes just as high as any formally declared war, with over 36,000 American service members killed, more than 100,000 wounded, and total casualties across all sides numbering in the millions. The war's position between World War II and the Vietnam War created a double overshadowing effect that left Korea squeezed out of historical consciousness, as the Vietnam War would come to dominate American society throughout the 1960s and early 1970s, with its massive anti-war movement, its divisive impact on American politics and culture, its extensive television coverage that brought the horrors of war directly into American living rooms, and its traumatic effect on an entire generation that would generate countless films, books, songs, and works of art that kept Vietnam at the center of cultural conversations for decades. The Korean War, sandwiched between these two more prominent conflicts, struggled to maintain its own distinct identity in public memory, and this problem was exemplified by the television series Mas Times H, which, despite being technically set during the Korean War, was widely understood as a commentary on Vietnam when it aired from 1972 to 1983, meaning that even the most prominent cultural artifact associated with the Korean War was really about something else, further blurring Korea's place in historical memory and contributing to its forgetting. The nature of the Korean War itself contributed significantly to its marginalization, as it was a frustrating, confusing conflict that defied easy narrative comprehension and lacked the clear moral framework and decisive outcomes that Americans had come to expect from their wars. The war's early months saw dramatic reversals of fortune, with North Korean forces nearly pushing United Nations troops off the peninsula entirely in a desperate defense around the Pusan perimeter, followed by General Douglas MacArthur's brilliant amphibious landing at Inchon in September 1950, that reversed the situation almost overnight and sent UN forces driving north toward the Chinese border, only to have hundreds of thousands of Chinese volunteers enter the war in late November 1950, sending UN forces reeling southward in chaotic winter retreats that raised the terrifying prospect of World War III and potential nuclear escalation. The controversy surrounding MacArthur's dismissal by President Truman in April 1951, stemming from their fundamental disagreement over war strategy and the principle of civilian control of the military, added political drama and constitutional significance to the conflict, but also created confusion and division at home about the war's purposes and conduct. After these dramatic opening phases filled with sweeping movements across the peninsula, the war settled into a frustrating stalemate by mid-1951, with both sides dug into defensive positions reminiscent of World War I trench warfare, while armistice negotiations dragged on for 2 agonizing years, during which soldiers continued to die, fighting over hills and ridgelines that often held no strategic value beyond their use as bargaining chips in the peace talks, creating a sense among many participants and observers that the war had become pointless even as the casualties mounted and the destruction continued. The war ended not with victory parades, ticker tape celebrations, or dramatic surrender ceremonies aboard battleships, but rather with an armistice signed on July 27, 1953, that essentially restored the border at the 38th parallel, close to where it had been when the war began, leaving Korea divided and the fundamental issues that had sparked the conflict unresolved. This inconclusive ending made the war extraordinarily difficult to commemorate in the triumphalist manner that Americans had grown accustomed to with World War II, as there was no clear sense of accomplishment or victory to celebrate. No defeated enemy signing unconditional surrender, no liberation of oppressed peoples, just a ceasefire that stopped the killing but left the political situation fundamentally unchanged and unsatisfying. The limited nature of public engagement with the Korean War compared to World War II also contributed significantly to its fading from collective memory, as the conflict did not require the kind of total societal mobilization, home front rationing, war bond drives, and collective sacrifice that had characterized the earlier war and created shared experiences across American society. While the draft was in effect and brought men into military service, most Americans did not serve in Korea, and for the vast majority of the population, daily life continued, largely undisturbed by events on the other side of the Pacific Ocean, with a booming post-war economy providing plentiful consumer goods and rising living standards that insulated most Americans from the war's impact. This disconnects between the intense, brutal combat experienced by those who served and the distant abstraction it represented for those at home meant that fewer Americans had personal connections to the war through family members or friends who had served. And without these personal connections, the broader public could more easily overlook or forget the conflict once it ended. Media coverage during the Korean War, while certainly present through newspapers, radio, and early television, did not dominate public attention or consciousness in the way that later television coverage would do for Vietnam, as the war occurred at a transitional moment when television was still relatively new and had not yet become the dominant news medium that would bring war into American homes with immediate visual impact, and the limited nature of this coverage meant that the war remained somewhat abstract and distant for many Americans. The Cold War context of the Korean War added another layer of psychological complexity that may have contributed to its forgetting, as the conflict represented the first hot military confrontation between communist and Western forces in the post-war era, and raised terrifying questions about whether the Cold War competition could spiral into World War III, complete with nuclear weapons being used, fears that were not merely hypothetical, given MacArthur's public suggestions about using atomic bombs against China, and Truman's infamous press conference statement that seemed to suggest nuclear weapons were under consideration. This frightening prospect of global nuclear war may have contributed to a collective psychological desire to minimize and distance from the Korean conflict, as Americans who had hoped that World War II would be the last great war they would need to endure were confronted with the deeply uncomfortable reality that the Cold War could turn hot at any moment, that the policy of communist containment would exact real costs measured in thousands of American lives, and that future wars might lack the clear victories and moral certainty of World War II. The inconclusive nature of the Korean War's ending, with the peninsula remaining divided along essentially the same line where the fighting had started and with tensions unresolved, served as an uncomfortable reminder of the potentially endless and unwinnable nature of Cold War competition. And some historians have suggested that the forgetting of the Korean War was partly a collective psychological defense mechanism, a way of avoiding confrontation with these disturbing truths about the post-war world and the nature of superpower rivalry. For many years following the armistice, the Korean War lacked the commemorative infrastructure and cultural representation that helped keep historical events alive in public consciousness and collective memory, as Korean War veterans often felt overlooked and underappreciated compared to their World War II counterparts, returning home to little fanfare, receiving limited public recognition for their service, and finding their experiences quickly overshadowed by other national concerns and the desire to move forward rather than dwell on an unsatisfying conflict. The absence of powerful cultural works, films, novels, memoirs, and artistic representations that might have kept the Korean War vivid in public imagination contributed significantly to its fading, as there was no Korean War equivalent to the vast library of World War II films and literature, or the powerful Vietnam War movies and music that would emerge in later decades to force engagement with those conflicts. It was not until 1995, more than 40 years after the armistice, that the Korean War Veterans Memorial was finally dedicated in Washington, D.C., a delay that itself symbolizes the marginalization of the conflict in American memory and represents the long struggle of veterans and their advocates for recognition and remembrance. The paradox at the heart of calling the Korean War forgotten becomes apparent when we recognize that for Koreans themselves, both in the North and South, the war is anything but forgotten. It is a living, ongoing reality that shapes their societies, politics, national identities, security situations, and daily lives in profound ways. With the division of families, the heavily militarized demilitarized zone, the vastly different developmental paths of the two Koreas, the periodic military crises, and North Korea's nuclear weapons program, all stemming directly from this conflict and its unresolved conclusion. The armistice signed in 1953 was merely a ceasefire, not a peace treaty, and the Korean Peninsula remains technically at war more than 70 years later, making this forgotten war perhaps the longest-running unresolved conflict of the modern era. In this crucial sense, the designation "forgotten war" reflects a particularly Western and especially American perspective, indicating not that the war was unimportant or without lasting consequences, but rather that it has been forgotten by those who had the luxury and distance to forget, those living far from the Korean Peninsula, who could move on with their lives once the shooting stopped, and who were never forced to reckon daily with the war's ongoing legacy the way Koreans have been. The term thus reveals more about the selective nature of historical memory in the West than it does about the war's actual significance, obscuring the conflict's genuine historical importance in establishing precedents for Cold War competition, demonstrating the willingness of communist powers to use force to expand their influence, testing the United Nations and collective security arrangements, solidifying the U.S.-South Korea alliance, contributing to the militarization of American foreign policy, and resulting in a divided peninsula, whose unresolved tensions continue to pose significant security challenges and threaten regional stability well into the 21st century, making the Korean War's legacy anything but forgotten for those who continue to live with its consequences. Origins of the Korean Peninsula Division. The division of the Korean Peninsula into North and South Korea represents one of the most tragic and enduring consequences of World War II and the subsequent Cold War, transforming a nation with over a millennium of cultural unity and shared history into two separate states, with fundamentally opposed political systems, incompatible ideologies, and a legacy of mutual hostility that persists into the 21st century. Understanding how this division came about requires examining the complex interplay of Japanese colonialism, Allied wartime planning, hasty decisions made in the chaotic final days of World War II, Cold War rivalry between the United States and Soviet Union, and the frustrated aspirations of the Korean people themselves, who emerged from decades of brutal Japanese occupation, only to find their homeland divided by foreign powers without their consultation or consent. Korea had maintained its independence and territorial integrity for centuries under the Joseon dynasty, developing a distinctive culture, language, and national identity, but this independence ended in 1910 when Japan formally annexed the peninsula following years of increasing Japanese influence and control, subjecting the Korean people to 35 years of harsh colonial rule, characterized by economic exploitation, cultural suppression, forced labor, military conscription, and systematic attempts to eradicate Korean identity through policies that banned the Korean language in schools and government, forced Koreans to adopt Japanese names, and sought to assimilate the peninsula into the Japanese Empire. During this long period of Japanese occupation, various Korean resistance movements emerged both within the peninsula and in exile, with Korean nationalists and independence activists operating from bases in China, the Soviet Union, and the United States. But these movements were fragmented along ideological lines, with some oriented toward communism and receiving support from the Soviet Union, others embracing nationalism or democratic principles, and still others advocating various combinations of these ideologies, creating a situation where there was no single unified Korean independence movement or universally recognized leadership that could speak for all Koreans when liberation finally came. As World War II progressed and Allied victory over Japan became increasingly certain, the question of Korea's post-war status began entering Allied planning discussions, though Korea was never a high priority compared to more pressing issues regarding the post-war settlement in Europe and the future of Japan itself. At the Cairo Conference in November 1943, President Franklin Roosevelt, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and Chinese leader Chiang Kai-shek issued a declaration that included the statement that, "In due course Korea shall become free and independent." But this carefully worded phrase, "in due course," was, quote, deliberately vague and would prove highly significant, as it implied that immediate independence was not contemplated and suggested instead some period of international trusteeship or preparation for self-governance, reflecting Allied assumptions that Koreans, after decades of colonial rule, were not yet ready for immediate independence and would require guidance from the great powers. At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, the Allied leaders discussed post-war arrangements in greater detail, and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin agreed that the Soviet Union would enter the war against Japan within 3 months of Germany's defeat, an agreement that would have profound and unforeseen consequences for Korea's future. When the Soviet Union declared war on Japan on August 8, 1945, just 2 days after the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and 1 day before the bombing of Nagasaki, Soviet forces rapidly advanced into Japanese-occupied Manchuria and began moving into northern Korea, encountering minimal resistance from demoralized Japanese forces who knew their empire was collapsing. The decision that would determine Korea's fate for the next 7 decades and beyond was made hastily on the night of August 10-11, 1945, when 2 relatively junior American officers, Colonel Dean Rusk, who would later become Secretary of State under Presidents Kennedy and Johnson, and Colonel Charles Bonesteel, were given the task of defining zones for accepting the Japanese surrender in Korea, working late at night with nothing more than a National Geographic map, and operating under severe time pressure as Soviet forces were already advancing rapidly down the Korean Peninsula, without any knowledge of Korean history, culture, or geography beyond what they could glean from their map, and with no time for careful analysis or consultation. These 2 officers drew a line across the peninsula at the 38th parallel of latitude, a line that had absolutely no historical, cultural, linguistic, or political significance in Korean history, but simply happened to roughly bisect the peninsula while ensuring that the capital city of Seoul would fall within the proposed American occupation zone. The primary American consideration was entirely pragmatic and defensive. Soviet forces were already on the ground in Korea and advancing rapidly southward, while no American forces were yet in position to occupy any part of the peninsula, so the Americans wanted to ensure they would control at least some portion of Korea and prevent complete Soviet domination of the peninsula, even though they had no immediate means of enforcing such a division. Somewhat surprisingly, when the American proposal for dividing Korea at the 38th parallel was transmitted to the Soviet Union, Stalin accepted it without objection, despite the fact that Soviet forces could have easily occupied the entire peninsula before American troops arrived, and the Soviets had no military reason to accept a division that would give the United States control of southern Korea. Stalin's motivations for accepting this division remain debated by historians, but likely reflected his desire to maintain the wartime alliance with the United States and Britain on more important issues in Europe, particularly regarding the occupation of Germany and the shape of post-war Eastern Europe, as well as possibly a calculation that Soviet influence could be established in northern Korea without needing to control the entire peninsula, and perhaps an assumption that the division would be temporary, and that a unified Korea under communist or Soviet-friendly leadership might eventually emerge through political means. American forces did not actually arrive in southern Korea until early September 1945, nearly a month after the Japanese surrender, and immediately established the United States Army military government in Korea, which would directly govern the American occupation zone until 1948, while Soviet forces established their own military administration in the northern zone. What had been conceived as a purely temporary expedient for the limited administrative purpose of accepting the Japanese surrender and disarming Japanese forces quickly began evolving into something more substantial and permanent as the two occupation zones developed along increasingly divergent paths that reflected the profound ideological differences between the occupying powers and their fundamentally incompatible visions for Korea's future. In the Soviet-occupied North, the Soviet authorities worked closely with Korean communists who had been living in exile in the Soviet Union or fighting as anti-Japanese guerrillas in Manchuria, most notably Kim Il-sung, a relatively young guerrilla commander who had fought against the Japanese and had received military training and political indoctrination in the Soviet Union. The Soviets helped install Kim Il-sung as the leader of an emerging communist government structure, implemented land reforms that redistributed property from landlords to peasants, nationalized major industries, and suppressed political opposition from non-communist groups, creating a one-party communist system that closely followed the Soviet model and established the foundations for what would become the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. In the American-occupied South, the situation was considerably more complex, chaotic, and politically contentious, as the American military government faced numerous challenges, including the absence of any single Korean leader or political group that commanded widespread popular support, intense competition among various political factions ranging from communists to moderate nationalists to conservative anti-communists, and the deeply unpopular American decision to initially retain many Koreans who had served in the Japanese colonial administration in their positions because they had administrative experience and technical skills, even though these collaborators were despised by most Koreans, who saw them as traitors. The Americans ultimately backed Syngman Rhee, an elderly Korean nationalist who had lived in exile in the United States for decades, had earned a PhD from Princeton University, had maintained connections with American political and religious leaders, and possessed strong anti-communist credentials, though he was authoritarian in temperament, lacked a strong popular base initially, and had been out of Korea for so long that he was somewhat out of touch with conditions on the peninsula. The division's impact on Korean society and economy was immediate and severe, as Korea had been developed as an integrated economic unit under Japanese colonial rule, with heavy industry, mining, and hydroelectric power concentrated in the mineral-rich northern regions, while agriculture was more prevalent in the southern regions. And the division disrupted these economic connections, severed transportation and communication networks, separated families, ended the free movement of people and goods that had characterized the unified peninsula, and created severe economic hardships in both zones. Various attempts were made to reunify Korea under a single government during the period from 1945 to 1948. But these efforts were doomed by the emerging Cold War rivalry between the United States and Soviet Union, which viewed Korea through the lens of global ideological competition rather than Korean national interests. The Moscow Conference of Foreign Ministers in December 1945 proposed a four-power trusteeship involving the United States, Soviet Union, Britain, and China that would temporarily govern Korea for up to 5 years while preparing it for independence. But this proposal generated intense opposition across the Korean political spectrum, as Koreans who had endured 35 years of Japanese colonial rule had no desire for another extended period of foreign trusteeship, and viewed the proposal as a betrayal of the promises of independence that had been made at Cairo. The Joint Soviet-American Commission met in 1946 and again in 1947 to work out the details of forming a unified Korean government. But these meetings quickly deadlocked over fundamental procedural and substantive issues, particularly regarding which Korean political groups should be consulted in the process of forming a government, with the Soviets insisting that groups opposed to the Moscow trusteeship agreement should be excluded from consultations, which would have eliminated most conservative and nationalist groups in the South, while the Americans wanted a more inclusive process that would allow all non-communist groups to participate, and neither side was willing to compromise because each feared that any unified government would fall under the other's sphere of influence. As the Joint Commission failed to make progress and the positions of the two occupation authorities hardened, the United States brought the Korean question to the United Nations General Assembly in 1947, which passed a resolution calling for elections throughout the contention entire peninsula to establish a unified government with a UN Temporary Commission on Korea to observe the elections and ensure they were conducted fairly, but Soviet authorities refused to allow the UN Commission to enter the northern zone, arguing that the UN had no jurisdiction over the matter and viewing the organization as dominated by Western powers and their interests. Faced with Soviet refusal to cooperate and allow UN-supervised elections in the north, the UN ultimately decided to proceed with elections only in the southern zone, where the Commission had access, despite objections from many Koreans who argued that holding separate elections would formalize and perpetuate the division of their nation. These elections were held on May 10, 1948, though they were boycotted by leftist groups, communists, and some moderate nationalist politicians who opposed the idea of establishing a separate southern government, and despite some violence and irregularities, the elections proceeded and resulted in victory for conservative and anti-communist parties associated with Syngman Rhee. On August 15, 1948, the Republic of Korea was formally proclaimed in Seoul, with Rhee as its first president, and with a constitution that claimed jurisdiction over the entire Korean peninsula, not just the southern zone, reflecting the South Korean government's position that it was the sole legitimate government of all Korea and that the division was temporary and illegitimate. The northern authorities responded to these developments by holding their own elections in August 1948, though these were conducted according to communist single-party principles rather than democratic procedures, and on September 9, 1948, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea was formally established with Kim Il-sung as premier, and this government also claimed to be the sole legitimate government of the entire Korean peninsula, creating a situation where two mutually hostile governments, each claiming sovereignty over all of Korea, faced each other across the 38th parallel. The two Korean states that emerged in 1948 were fundamentally different in almost every respect. South Korea under Syngman Rhee was authoritarian and strongly anti-communist, but maintained a capitalist market economy, allowed some degree of political pluralism despite severe restrictions on leftist activity, and aligned itself firmly with the United States and the Western Bloc, while North Korea under Kim Il-sung developed into a highly centralized Stalinist state with complete government control over the economy through nationalization and collectivization, absolute suppression of political opposition, an emerging personality cult around Kim Il-sung, and close alignment with the Soviet Union and increasingly with Communist China. Both the Soviet Union and the United States withdrew the bulk of their occupation forces from Korea by 1949, though they left behind military advisory groups and continued providing economic and military aid to their respective Korean clients. And this withdrawal was significant because it left the two Korean states, each possessing its own army, trained and equipped by its superpower patron, each claiming legitimacy over the entire peninsula, and each led by leaders who spoke openly about reunification by force if necessary, facing each other across a tense border with minimal direct great power restraint. Border incidents, armed clashes, and raids were frequent along the 38th parallel throughout 1949 and early 1950, with both sides conducting military probes and provocations, and both Kim Il-sung in the north and Syngman Rhee in the south repeatedly expressed their intention to reunify Korea under their respective governments, with Kim persistently lobbying Stalin for permission and support to launch a full-scale invasion of the South, arguing that the southern population would rise up to support northern forces and that reunification could be achieved quickly before the United States could effectively intervene. The division of Korea that had originated in a hasty decision made by two American colonels working with a map in August 1945, intended as a temporary administrative expedient for accepting the Japanese surrender, had by 1950 hardened into two separate states with incompatible political systems, competing claims to legitimacy, substantial military forces, backing from opposing sides in the global Cold War confrontation, and leaders committed to reunification on their own terms, creating all the preconditions for the war that would erupt on June 25, 1950, when North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel in a massive invasion that Kim Il-sung and Stalin believed would quickly reunify the peninsula under communist rule, but which instead triggered a 3-year war that would kill millions, devastate the peninsula, nearly spark World War III, and ultimately leave Korea divided along essentially the same line where it had been divided 5 years earlier, making the division permanent and creating one of the most enduring and dangerous legacies of the Cold War that persists into the present day. Outbreak of War, 1950. The outbreak of the Korean War on June 25, 1950, represents one of the most significant moments in Cold War history, marking the first major military confrontation between Communist and Western forces in the post-war era, and transforming what had been a tense ideological standoff into a hot war that would claim millions of lives, devastate the Korean Peninsula, and bring the world perilously close to a third global conflict, potentially involving nuclear weapons. The war's beginning was neither spontaneous nor accidental, but rather the result of careful planning by North Korean leader Kim Il-sung, who had been persistently lobbying Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin for permission and support to launch a military invasion of South Korea to reunify the peninsula under communist rule, arguing that the moment was opportune because South Korea's military was weak, its government under Syngman Rhee was unpopular, and the southern population would welcome liberation by northern forces. Kim Il-sung's confidence in a quick victory was based on several factors, including the withdrawal of American occupation forces from South Korea in 1949, which left behind only a small military advisory group, statements by American officials, including Secretary of State Dean Acheson in his famous speech at the National Press Club in January 1950, that seemed to place South Korea outside the American defensive perimeter in Asia, the belief that the United States was war-weary after World War II and would not intervene in what could be portrayed as a Korean Civil War, and the assessment that South Korea's army, while numbering over 90,000 men, was poorly equipped, inadequately trained, and lacked heavy weapons, armor, and air support that would be necessary to repel a determined invasion. Stalin had initially been reluctant to approve Kim's invasion plans, fearing that such an attack might provoke American intervention and possibly escalate into a broader conflict with the United States, at a time when the Soviet Union was still recovering from the devastation of World War II and was focused on consolidating its control over Eastern Europe. But several factors eventually convinced Stalin to give his consent, including the communist victory in China in 1949, which shifted the balance of power in Asia, the successful Soviet test of an atomic bomb in August 1949, which reduced American nuclear superiority, Kim Il-sung's persistent arguments that victory could be achieved quickly before the United States could respond effectively, and perhaps Stalin's calculation that even if the attack failed, it would divert American attention and resources away from Europe, where the Cold War confrontation was most intense. By early 1950, Stalin had given his conditional approval for the invasion, though he insisted that Kim Il-sung also secure the support of Chinese leader Mao Zedong, both to ensure that China would provide assistance if needed, and to share the risk and responsibility for the venture with Beijing, rather than Moscow bearing it alone. Mao, despite some initial reservations about the timing and his own preoccupation with consolidating communist control in China and planning for the invasion of Taiwan, eventually agreed to support the operation, influenced by his commitment to communist solidarity, his own revolutionary ideology, that viewed the reunification of Korea as part of the broader anti-imperialist struggle, and Stalin's assurances that victory would be swift and American intervention unlikely. With both Soviet and Chinese backing secured, Kim Il-sung proceeded with intensive military preparations throughout the spring of 1950, building up North Korean forces along the 38th parallel, positioning tanks, artillery, and troops for the invasion, conducting reconnaissance of South Korean defenses, and developing operational plans for a multi-pronged offensive that would strike southward with overwhelming force to capture Seoul quickly, and then continue driving south to conquer the entire peninsula before the United States and other powers could organize an effective response. The North Korean People's Army that Kim Il-sung had assembled for this invasion was a formidable force by the standards of the region and time, numbering approximately 135,000 well-trained and highly motivated troops, many of whom were Korean veterans who had fought with the Chinese Communists during the Chinese Civil War and had recently returned, Korea bringing valuable combat experience, equipped with Soviet-supplied weapons, including 34 tanks which were among the best medium tanks of World War II, and against which South Korean forces had no effective defense, artillery pieces, aircraft, and other heavy equipment that gave North Korea overwhelming military superiority over the South. In the early morning hours of June 25, 1950, North Korean forces launched their invasion across the 38th parallel along multiple axes, with the main thrust aimed at Seoul, South Korea's capital, located only about 30 miles south of the border, accompanied by supporting attacks at other points along the frontier, designed to prevent South Korean forces from concentrating their defenses and to create maximum confusion. The attack achieved complete tactical surprise despite some intelligence warnings that had been received but not adequately acted upon, and South Korean forces, many of whom were on weekend leave and unprepared for combat, were quickly overwhelmed by the combination of North Korean infantry, armor, and artillery that smashed through their defensive positions. The invasion's timing was deliberately chosen for a Sunday morning, when many South Korean officers and soldiers would be away from their units, and this timing, combined with the intensity and coordination of the North Korean assault, created immediate chaos in the South Korean military command structure and prevented any organized defensive response in the critical early hours when the invasion might have been blunted. North Korean forces advanced rapidly southward, with their 34 tanks leading the way, and South Korean troops unable to stop or even slow the armored columns because they lacked anti-tank weapons capable of penetrating the 34's armor. And within 3 days of the invasion's start, Seoul fell to North Korean forces on June 28, 1950, representing a devastating blow to South Korean morale and seeming to confirm Kim Il-sung's prediction of quick victory. The South Korean government and military headquarters fled southward in disarray, with President Syngman Rhee and his administration relocating first to Daejeon and then further south as North Korean forces continued their relentless advance, and the South Korean army, despite pockets of brave resistance, was largely in retreat, losing equipment, suffering heavy casualties, and struggling to maintain any coherent defensive line against the better equipped and better trained North Korean forces. The international response to the invasion was swift and, from North Korea's perspective, unexpectedly strong, as the United States and other Western powers viewed the attack not merely as a local conflict, but as a test of collective security and containment policy, with President Harry Truman and his advisors concluding that failure to respond would encourage further communist aggression elsewhere in Asia and Europe and would undermine American credibility and the entire structure of post-war international order that the United States had worked to establish. On the very day of the invasion, June 25, 1950, the United Nations Security Council, meeting in emergency session, and with the Soviet Union absent due to its boycott over the UN's refusal to seat Communist China, passed Resolution 82, condemning the North Korean attack as a breach of peace, and calling for the immediate cessation of hostilities and withdrawal of North Korean forces to the 38th parallel. 2 days later, on June 27, the Security Council adopted Resolution 83, which recommended that UN members provide assistance to South Korea to repel the attack and restore peace and security, effectively authorizing military intervention under UN auspices, and this resolution provided the legal framework for what would become a UN-commanded military operation. Though in reality, United States would provide the overwhelming majority of non-Korean forces and would exercise operational control throughout the war. President Truman, without waiting for congressional authorization and relying on his authority as commander-in-chief and the UN resolutions, immediately ordered American air and naval forces to support South Korea, and on June 30, just 5 days after the invasion began, authorized the commitment of American ground combat troops, initially sending elements of the U.S. Combat 8th Army stationed in Japan under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, who was also designated as the commander of United Nations forces in Korea. The first American ground forces to enter combat in Korea were Task Force Smith, a small battalion-sized unit of about 540 soldiers from the 24th Infantry Division, which was rushed from Japan to Korea and deployed near Osan, south of Seoul, on July 5, 1950, with the mission of delaying the North Korean advance and buying time for additional American forces to arrive and establish a defensive perimeter. Task Force Smith's encounter with North Korean forces proved disastrous and sobering, as the American soldiers, many of whom were young, poorly trained occupation troops who had been enjoying comfortable garrison duty in Japan and had never experienced combat, found themselves facing North Korean 34 tanks that their light weapons could not damage, and veteran North Korean infantry that quickly outflanked and overwhelmed their positions, resulting in Task Force Smith suffering heavy casualties and being forced to retreat in disorder after just a few hours of fighting, leaving behind much of its equipment, and demonstrating that American forces were not prepared for the kind of war they were about to fight. This initial defeat was followed by several weeks of difficult and costly fighting as additional American units arrived in Korea and attempted to slow the North Korean advance, suffering defeats and setbacks as they retreated southward, losing equipment and men, and struggling to adapt to combat conditions that were very different from what they had trained for, fighting an enemy that was experienced, well-equipped, and highly motivated, in terrain that was rugged and poorly suited to American advantages in mechanized warfare and air power. By early August 1950, UN forces, consisting primarily of American and South Korean troops, with small contingents from other UN member nations beginning to arrive, had been pushed back into a small perimeter around the port city of Pusan in the southeastern corner of the Korean Peninsula, an area that came to be known as the Pusan Perimeter, representing the last defensible position on the peninsula and the final line that had to be held if South Korea was to survive as an independent state. The Pusan Perimeter encompassed an area roughly 100 miles long and 50 miles deep, anchored on the Korean Strait to the south and east, providing access to seaborne supplies and reinforcements that were essential to sustaining the defense, and General Walton Walker, commanding the 8th Army, established a defensive line along the Naktong River and surrounding high ground, issuing his famous "Stand or Die" order that there would be no more retreating and that every position must be held. The battle for the Pusan Perimeter raged throughout August and early September 1950, with North Korean forces launching repeated attacks against the perimeter from multiple directions, attempting to break through the UN lines and capture Pusan before UN forces could be sufficiently reinforced and reorganized. While UN forces, now benefiting from air superiority, naval gunfire support, and steadily arriving reinforcements of troops and equipment, fought desperately to hold every position, launching counterattacks to restore breached sections of the line, and gradually building up the strength and capability that would be needed not just to hold, but eventually to break out and go on the offensive. The fighting around the Pusan perimeter was brutal and intense, characterized by close-quarters combat, heavy casualties on both sides, summer heat and humidity that exhausted soldiers already under extreme physical and psychological stress, and a growing realization among North Korean commanders that their offensive was stalling, that the opportunity for quick victory had passed, and that they were now facing an increasingly powerful enemy that would soon be capable of taking the offensive and reversing the war's momentum. The outbreak of war in June 1950 thus transformed the Korean Peninsula from a tense but stable Cold War division into an active battlefield that would become the focal point of global attention and anxiety, demonstrating that the Cold War could quickly turn hot, that communist powers were willing to use military force to advance their objectives, that the United States and its allies were prepared to resist such aggression even at substantial cost, and that the United Nations could, under certain circumstances, function as a collective security organization capable of authorizing and coordinating military action against aggression. The war's outbreak also revealed the dangers of miscalculation on both sides, with Kim Il-sung and Stalin underestimating American willingness to intervene in defense of South Korea, while American officials had failed to clearly communicate their commitment to South Korea's defense and had not adequately prepared South Korean forces to resist invasion, creating ambiguities that may have contributed to North Korean confidence that invasion would succeed without triggering American intervention. The initial phase of the war, from the June 25 invasion through the desperate defense of the Pusan perimeter in August and September, established patterns that would characterize the entire conflict, including the importance of terrain in the mountainous Korean Peninsula, the devastating effectiveness of American air power when it could be brought to bear, the resilience and fighting quality of South Korean forces once they recovered from the initial shock and were properly equipped and organized, the willingness of both sides to accept enormous casualties in pursuit of their objectives, and the ever-present danger that the conflict could escalate beyond Korea to involve China directly and possibly the Soviet Union, raising the specter of World War III that would haunt decision-makers in Washington, Moscow, and Beijing throughout the war. U.S. decision to intervene. The United States' decision to intervene militarily in Korea following the North Korean invasion of June 25, 1950, represents one of the most consequential foreign policy choices in American history, fundamentally reshaping the nature of the Cold War, establishing precedents for future American military interventions, and committing the United States to a costly war that would last 3 years and claim tens of thousands of American lives. The decision was made with remarkable speed, reflecting both the perceived urgency of the situation and the clarity with which President Harry Truman and his advisors viewed the North Korean attack through the lens of Cold War competition and the lessons they believed they had learned from the failures of appeasement in the 1930s that had led to World War II. When news of the North Korean invasion reached Washington on the evening of Saturday, June 24, 1950, due to the time difference between Korea and the United States, President Truman was at his home in Independence, Missouri, and was immediately informed by Secretary of State Dean Acheson, who recommended that the matter be brought before the United Nations Security Council and that Truman return to Washington as quickly as possible to convene his top national security advisors to formulate a response. Truman flew back to Washington on Sunday, June 25, and that evening met with his key advisors, including Acheson, Secretary of Defense Lewis Johnson, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and other senior officials at Blair House, the presidential guest residence where Truman was living while the White House underwent renovations, and this meeting would be the first of several crucial gatherings over the next few days, during which the fundamental decisions about American intervention would be made. The discussions at these Blair House meetings revealed a remarkable consensus among American leaders that the North Korean attack represented not merely a local conflict on a distant peninsula, but rather a critical test of American resolve, credibility, and the entire structure of post-war collective security that the United States had worked to establish through the United Nations and various alliance systems. The dominant framework through which American officials interpreted the invasion was shaped by what they considered the painful lessons of the 1930s, when British and French appeasement of Nazi Germany's territorial demands had failed to prevent World War II and had instead encouraged further aggression by demonstrating that democracies lacked the will to resist totalitarian expansion. Truman and his advisors were determined not to repeat what they saw as the mistakes of Neville Chamberlain at Munich, and they believed that failure to respond forcefully to communist aggression in Korea would invite further attacks elsewhere, potentially in more vital areas such as Western Europe, the Middle East, or Japan, and would fundamentally undermine American credibility and the confidence of allies who depended on American security guarantees. Secretary of State Acheson was particularly influential in shaping the administration's response, arguing forcefully that the invasion was a clear act of aggression that demanded a strong response, that the United States had both moral and strategic interests in defending South Korea, and that the availability of the United Nations as a framework for collective action provided both legal authority and international legitimacy for American intervention that should not be squandered. The speed and decisiveness of Truman's response also reflected his personal character and leadership style, as he was known for making decisions quickly once he had heard the arguments and assessed the situation, and he had little patience for prolonged deliberation when he believed the right course of action was clear. At the first Blair House meeting on the evening of June 25, even before any formal decisions were made, the consensus was already forming that the United States would need to provide substantial support to South Korea, and the initial decisions included authorizing General Douglas MacArthur to provide ammunition and equipment to South Korean forces, to use American air power to protect the evacuation of American civilians from Korea, and to deploy the 7th Fleet to the Taiwan Strait, to prevent the conflict from spreading through a Chinese communist invasion of Taiwan or a nationalist Chinese attack on the mainland that might bring China more directly into the Korean situation. Over the next several days, as reports from Korea made clear that South Korean forces were collapsing under the North Korean onslaught, and that without direct American military intervention, South Korea would be completely overrun within days or weeks, Truman authorized increasingly extensive American involvement, first allowing American aircraft to operate south of the 38th parallel in support of South Korean ground forces, then authorizing air and naval operations north of the 38th parallel against North Korean military targets, and finally on June 30th, making the crucial decision to commit American ground combat troops to Korea, initially ordering elements of the 8th Army stationed in Japan to deploy to Korea under MacArthur's command. The decision to commit ground forces was recognized as a major escalation that would involve substantial American casualties and an open-ended military commitment whose duration and ultimate cost could not be predicted, but Truman and his advisors concluded that air and naval support alone would be insufficient to prevent South Korea's collapse, and that American soldiers would need to fight alongside South Korean forces if the invasion was to be repelled. The United Nations provided important international legitimacy for American intervention, as the Security Council, meeting in emergency session on June 25, with the Soviet Union, absent due to its ongoing boycott over the UN's refusal to seat Communist China in place of nationalist China, passed Resolution 82, condemning the North Korean attack and calling for an immediate ceasefire and withdrawal of North Korean forces, and then on June 27 passed Resolution 83, recommending that UN members provide assistance to South Korea to repel the attack and restore international peace and security. These UN resolutions gave American intervention the character of a collective security action undertaken on behalf of the international community, rather than a unilateral American military operation, though in practice the United States would provide the overwhelming majority of non-Korean forces and would exercise operational control over the war effort throughout the conflict. Truman's decision to intervene without seeking a formal declaration of war from Congress was controversial, and established a precedent that would be debated for decades, as he relied instead on his constitutional authority as commander-in-chief, the UN Security Council resolutions, and the argument that he was engaging in a police action to enforce UN decisions rather than initiating a war in the traditional sense. But this approach allowed him to act quickly, without the delays and political debates that would have accompanied a request for congressional authorization, though it also meant that the war would be fought without the formal political and national commitment that a declaration of war would have symbolized. The factors influencing the American decision to intervene were multiple and complex, reflecting both immediate strategic considerations specific to Korea and broader concerns about the global Cold War competition with the Soviet Union and international communist movement. One crucial factor was the belief, strongly held by Truman and most of his advisors, that the North Korean invasion was not an independent action by Kim Il-sung, but rather was directed by Moscow as part of a coordinated communist strategy to test American resolve and expand Soviet influence. And while we now know from historical research and released Soviet documents that Stalin did approve and support the invasion, American officials at the time significantly overestimated the degree of Soviet control and underestimated the role of Kim Il-sung's own ambitions and Chinese involvement in the decision. This assumption that Moscow was behind the invasion made the Korean situation seem even more critical, as it suggested that failure to respond would demonstrate to the Soviets that they could pursue aggressive expansion without serious consequences, potentially encouraging Soviet adventurism in more vital areas such as Berlin, where tensions remained high, or Iran, where Soviet pressure continued, or elsewhere along the extensive periphery of the communist bloc. The recent communist victory in China in 1949 had already been a major psychological and strategic blow to American policy in Asia, leading to bitter domestic political recriminations about who lost China, and creating pressure on the Truman administration to demonstrate that it would not allow further communist expansion in Asia. And this domestic political context made it virtually impossible for Truman to stand aside while another Asian nation fell to communist control without attempting to prevent it. The specific strategic importance of Korea itself was debated among American military and civilian leaders, with some arguing that the peninsula was not vital to American security interests and that American forces would be better positioned in more defensible and strategically important locations such as Japan or the Philippines. But this view was overridden by the broader argument that the symbolic and political significance of responding to aggression transcended Korea's specific strategic value. General Omar Bradley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, would later famously describe a potential wider war with China as the wrong war, at the wrong place, at the wrong time, and with the wrong enemy, reflecting continuing ambivalence among some military leaders about the wisdom of major ground operations on the Asian mainland. But even Bradley and others who harbored such reservations supported the initial decision to intervene in Korea because they accepted the political and psychological arguments about the need to demonstrate American resolve. The fact that substantial American forces were already stationed in nearby Japan under MacArthur's command made intervention logistically feasible in a way that would not have been possible if forces had needed to be deployed from the United States, though, as events would quickly demonstrate, these occupation forces in Japan were poorly trained and equipped for combat, and their initial performance in Korea would be disappointing. The decision to intervene was also influenced by assessments, which would prove overly optimistic about how quickly the situation could be resolved, with initial expectations that American military power, particularly air superiority and naval capabilities, would quickly turn the tide, and that North Korean forces would be unable to sustain their offensive once confronted with American intervention, leading to hopes that the war might be concluded within weeks or months rather than the 3 years it would actually last. These optimistic assumptions reflected both confidence in American military superiority and underestimation of North Korean military capabilities. The determination of communist forces to persist despite casualties and setbacks, and the possibility that China might directly intervene if UN forces advance toward the Chinese border. The domestic political context in the United States also shaped the intervention decision, as Truman was facing intense criticism from Republicans and some Democrats who accused his administration of being soft on communism, particularly after the fall of China and the recent revelation of Soviet espionage activities in the United States, and failure to respond to the Korean invasion would have provided additional ammunition to these critics and would have been politically devastating to Truman and the Democratic Party heading into the 1952 presidential election. Truman was also motivated by genuine moral considerations and belief in the principles of collective security and international law that the United Nations embodied, seeing the Korean situation as a clear case of unprovoked aggression against a peaceful neighbor that violated the fundamental norms that were supposed to govern international relations in the post-World War II era. And he believed that if the international community failed to respond to such blatant aggression, the entire UN system and hope for a peaceful world order would be fatally undermined. The consultation process during these crucial days was largely limited to a small circle of top national security officials, with Congress informed of decisions rather than consulted about them, and with little involvement of the broader American public beyond consuming news reports about the crisis, reflecting both the speed with which events were moving and the strong executive-centered approach to foreign policy that had developed during World War II and the early Cold War years. Some members of Congress, particularly Republicans, who were critical of Truman's foreign policy, would later question whether the president had the constitutional authority to commit American forces to combat without congressional authorization, and this debate about the proper constitutional roles of the president and Congress in war-making decisions would continue through subsequent conflicts in Vietnam, the Persian Gulf, and beyond. But in the immediate crisis of late June 1950, there was broad bipartisan support for Truman's decisions, with most members of Congress and most of the American public backing the intervention based on the arguments about resisting communist aggression and defending international law. The American decision to intervene in Korea thus represented a convergence of multiple factors, including perceived lessons from the failures of appeasement in the 1930s, Cold War assumptions about monolithic communist expansion directed from Moscow, domestic political pressures to demonstrate toughness against communism, genuine moral concerns about aggression and collective security, confidence in American military capabilities, and the personal leadership style and convictions of President Truman and his key advisors, all coming together in a moment of perceived crisis to produce a rapid decision to commit American military power to a conflict whose eventual costs and consequences would far exceed initial expectations and would fundamentally shape American foreign policy and military strategy for the remainder of the Cold War and beyond. The role of the United Nations. The role of the United Nations in the Korean War represents one of the most significant and controversial chapters in the organization's history, marking the first and, for many decades, the only time that the UN authorized and conducted a major military operation under its flag to repel aggression, and this unprecedented collective security action demonstrated both the potential and the limitations of the UN as an instrument for maintaining international peace and security. The UN's involvement in Korea began immediately after the North Korean invasion on June 25, 1950. When the United States brought the matter before the UN Security Council, which convened an emergency session on the very day of the invasion. And the timing and circumstances of this meeting would prove crucial to everything that followed, because the Soviet Union was absent from the Security Council at that moment due to its ongoing boycott that had begun in January 1950 to protest the UN's refusal to recognize the communist government in Beijing, seat its representatives in place of the nationalist Chinese government that had fled to Taiwan. The Soviet absence meant that the Security Council could act without the threat of a Soviet veto, and on June 25, the Council passed Resolution 82 by a vote of 9-0, with Yugoslavia abstaining, determining that the North Korean attack constituted a breach of the peace and calling for the immediate cessation of hostilities and the withdrawal of North Korean forces to the 38th parallel. And this resolution established the legal and moral framework within which all subsequent UN action on Korea would be justified. 2 days later, on June 27, with North Korean forces continuing their advance and South Korea facing imminent collapse, the Security Council passed Resolution 83, which went much further by recommending that UN member states furnish such assistance to South Korea as might be necessary to repel the armed attack and to restore international peace and security in the area, and this resolution effectively authorized military intervention under UN auspices and provided the legal basis for what would become a UN-commanded military operation involving forces from 16 nations fighting alongside South Korean troops. The UN's role in Korea was unprecedented because never before had the organization authorized and coordinated military action on such a scale, and the Korean intervention came closer than any previous or subsequent UN operation to realizing the vision of collective security that had been central to the organization's founding charter, which envisioned that aggression by any nation would be met by the collective response of the international community acting through UN mechanisms. On July 7, 1950, the Security Council adopted Resolution 84, which recommended that members providing military forces and other assistance to South Korea make such forces and assistance available to a unified command under the United States, requested that the United States designate the commander of such forces, and authorize the unified command to use the UN flag in operations, and in response, President Truman appointed General Douglas MacArthur as Commander-in-Chief of United Nations forces, creating the legal and organizational structure under which the war would be fought. The decision to place the unified command under American leadership and to have the United States exercise operational control reflected both practical realities, since American forces would constitute the vast majority of non-Korean troops, and the United States possessed the military capability and infrastructure to command such a large-scale operation, and political factors as the United States was the driving force behind the intervention, and other nations were willing to accept American leadership in exchange for the legitimacy that UN authorization provided. The UN flag flew alongside national flags in Korea, and the conflict was officially designated a UN police action rather than a war, giving it a unique character that distinguished it from traditional wars between nation-states and theoretically positioning it as an international law enforcement operation undertaken on behalf of the entire international community to punish aggression and restore peace. However, the UN's role in Korea was complicated by numerous tensions and limitations that revealed the gap between the ideal of collective security and the reality of how the organization functioned within the context of Cold War rivalries and national interests. While 16 nations beyond South Korea and the United States contributed military forces to the UN command, including the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, Turkey, Thailand, the Philippines, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Colombia, Ethiopia, Greece, Luxembourg, New Zealand, South Africa, and various other nations that provided medical units or other support, the overwhelming majority of non-Korean forces were American, with United States troops at their peak, numbering over 300,000, while other UN contingents combined never exceeded 50,000, meaning that the war was, in practical terms, an American military operation conducted with UN authorization, rather than a truly multilateral effort in which burdens and decision-making were broadly shared. The Soviet Union returned to the Security Council in August 1950 and immediately began using its veto power to block any further Security Council resolutions on Korea, leading the UN to shift consideration of Korean matters to the General Assembly, where no nation had veto power. And in November 1950, the General Assembly passed the Uniting for Peace resolution, which established that if the Security Council was paralyzed by vetoes, the General Assembly could meet in emergency special session to recommend collective measures, including the use of armed force, and this resolution represented an attempt to work around Soviet obstruction, but also raised questions about whether it was consistent with the UN Charter's provisions regarding the respective roles of the Security Council and General Assembly. The UN's involvement in Korea also raised complex questions about the relationship between national command authority and international authorization. As General MacArthur reported to the United States Joint Chiefs of Staff and through them to President Truman, rather than to any UN body, meaning that operational decisions, including MacArthur's decision to cross the 38th parallel and advance toward the Chinese border in autumn 1950, were made by American authorities based on American national interests and strategic assessments, rather than through genuine international consultation and consensus. Even though these decisions were being made by the commander of UN forces and committed the organization to increasingly ambitious war aims that went well beyond the original Security Council resolutions, which had called only for repelling the attack and restoring the status quo ante bellum. When Chinese forces intervened in late November 1950 in response to UN forces approaching the Yalu River and the Chinese border, the war expanded dramatically and raised the question of whether the UN was now at war with China, a question that was never clearly resolved and created ongoing diplomatic and legal ambiguities, and the General Assembly eventually passed a resolution in February 1951 declaring China an aggressor. But this resolution was controversial and not universally supported even among UN members who had contributed forces to Korea. The Armistice Negotiations that began in July 1951 and eventually concluded in July 1953 were conducted primarily by American and communist representatives, with limited UN involvement beyond the fact that the senior UN negotiator was technically representing the UN command, and the final armistice agreement was signed by the commander of UN forces, the supreme commander of the Korean People's Army, and the commander of the Chinese People's Volunteers, with no direct South Korean signature because President Syngman Rhee refused to accept the armistice terms, revealing that even the government that the UN had intervened to defend was not fully supportive of the settlement that ended the fighting. The Korean War's impact on the United Nations as an institution was profound and lasting, as it demonstrated that under very specific circumstances, particularly when the major powers were not all present to exercise their vetoes, the UN could authorize and coordinate military action to resist aggression. But it also revealed how difficult it would be to replicate this achievement when the Soviet Union and later China, as a permanent Security Council member, could veto any resolution they opposed. The Korean experience established precedents for UN peacekeeping and enforcement operations that would influence later missions, but it also showed the limitations of collective security in a world divided by Cold War rivalries, where any major crisis was likely to involve the interests of one or more permanent Security Council members who could block UN action through their veto power. The fact that the UN was able to act in Korea only because of the Soviet Union's temporary absence from the Security Council meant that this model of collective security action could not easily be repeated, and indeed for the next 4 decades, until the end of the Cold War, the UN never again authorized a major military operation comparable to Korea, as the Security Council remained largely paralyzed by superpower rivalry and the veto power that each permanent member possessed. The Korean War thus represents both the high water mark of UN collective security action and a demonstration of why such action has remained exceptional rather than routine, revealing both the noble aspirations embodied in the UN Charter and the harsh realities of international politics that limit what even the most idealistic international organizations can achieve when confronted with conflicts that engage the vital interests of major powers, leaving the Korean experience as a unique moment in UN history that has never been fully replicated. and whose lessons remain debated by scholars, diplomats, and policymakers seeking to understand the possibilities and limitations of international collective action to maintain peace and security in a world of sovereign states with competing interests and conflicting ideologies. The Pusan Perimeter Defense. The Pusan Perimeter Defense represents one of the most critical and dramatic episodes of the Korean War. A desperate struggle during August and early September 1950, when United Nations forces, consisting primarily of American and South Korean troops, with small contingents from other nations beginning to arrive, found themselves compressed into a small rectangular area in the southeastern corner of the Korean Peninsula, around the port city of Pusan, fighting for survival against relentless North Korean attacks that threatened to drive them into the sea and complete the communist conquest of South Korea. The establishment of the Pusan perimeter came after 2 months of nearly continuous retreat following the initial North Korean invasion on June 25, 1950, during which UN forces had been pushed steadily southward by superior North Korean numbers, firepower, and tactical expertise, suffering defeats at Osan, Daejeon, and numerous other locations as they attempted unsuccessfully to establish defensive lines that would halt the North Korean advance. By the end of July 1950, it had become clear that UN forces needed to establish a final defensive position that could be held long enough to allow sufficient reinforcements, equipment, and supplies to arrive from the United States and other contributing nations to transform the military balance and eventually permit a counter-offensive, and the area around Pusan was selected for this last-stand defense because it provided several crucial advantages, including access to the port of Pusan itself, which was essential for receiving the continuous flow of reinforcements and supplies that would be needed to sustain the defense, the nearby Daegu airfield, which provided vital air support capabilities, relatively defensible terrain, featuring rivers and mountains that could anchor defensive positions, and enough depth that even if North Korean forces penetrated the perimeter at some points, there would be room for counterattacks and the restoration of the Pruvet, the defensive line, without the entire position collapsing. The Pusan perimeter was roughly rectangular in shape, extending approximately 100 miles from north to south and 50 miles from east to west, at its widest points, bounded on the east and south by the Korean Strait and the Sea of Japan, which provided security on those flanks and access to naval gunfire support from American and British warships that could deliver devastating bombardments against North Korean positions, while the western and northern sides of the perimeter followed the Naktong River for much of its length, with the river serving as a natural defensive barrier that North Korean forces would need to cross under fire to attack UN positions. General Walton Walker, commanding the 8th Army, which constituted the main UN ground force in Korea, established his headquarters at Daegu in the northern part of the perimeter and organized the defense by assigning sectors to different units, with American divisions holding the most threatened sections of the line, while South Korean divisions, which were being rapidly rebuilt and re-equipped after their earlier defeats, held other sectors, and Walker famously issued his stand or die order in late July, telling his commanders that there would be no more retreating, that every position must be held, and that if units were forced back, they must immediately counterattack to restore the line, recognizing that the success of the entire defense depended on preventing any major breakthrough that could unravel the entire perimeter and lead to the collapse of UN forces in Korea. The period from early August through mid-September 1950 saw intense and nearly continuous fighting around the perimeter as North Korean forces launched multiple major offensives, attempting to break through the UN lines, with attacks coming from different directions at different times, sometimes simultaneously at multiple points, designed to stretch UN defenses thin, find weak spots that could be exploited for a breakthrough that would open the way to Pusan and final victory. The North Korean strategy was based on the belief that if they could maintain offensive pressure and prevent UN forces from establishing a stable defensive line, they could achieve victory before American reinforcements arrived in sufficient strength to change the military balance, and North Korean commanders drove their troops forward in repeated attacks despite heavy casualties, showing remarkable determination and willingness to accept losses that reflected both communist military doctrine that emphasized offensive action and mass over firepower, and the sense of urgency created by the knowledge that time was working against them as every day brought more American forces and equipment into the perimeter. American and UN forces benefited from several crucial advantages that ultimately proved decisive in holding the perimeter, including complete air superiority that allowed UN aircraft to attack North Korean supply lines, troop concentrations, and attacking formations with devastating effect using napalm, bombs, and machine gun fire, naval gunfire support from warships stationed offshore that could deliver accurate and massive firepower against North Korean positions near the coast, the continuous arrival of reinforcements that allowed Walker to rotate exhausted units out of the line and bring fresh troops into threatened sectors, and the interior lines of communication within the perimeter that allowed forces to be shifted quickly from quiet sectors to areas under attack more rapidly than North Korean forces could redeploy around the exterior of the perimeter. The fighting around the Pusan perimeter was characterized by intense combat in mountainous and often heavily vegetated terrain that made movement difficult and favored defensive positions, the brutal heat and humidity of Korean summer that exhausted soldiers already under extreme physical and psychological stress, and the close quarters nature of much of the combat, where American advantages in artillery and air power were sometimes limited by the proximity of opposing forces and difficult terrain. Throughout the defense, Walker demonstrated considerable skill in managing his limited forces, shifting units from threatened sector to threatened sector, using his small reserve forces to plug gaps and launch counterattacks at critical moments, and maintaining the morale and fighting spirit of troops who were exhausted, outnumbered at many points along the line, and fighting under extremely difficult conditions. By early September 1950, after more than a month of continuous fighting, the North Korean offensive around the Pusan perimeter was exhausted, with North Korean units having suffered enormous casualties, estimated at over 50,000 killed and wounded. Having outrun their supply lines, which were being continuously attacked by UN air power, and having failed to achieve the breakthrough that would have brought them victory, despite repeated attempts at multiple points around the perimeter. UN forces, while also exhausted and having suffered significant casualties, had held the perimeter intact, had received sufficient reinforcements to more than replace their losses, and were preparing for the counter-offensive that would begin with MacArthur's amphibious landing at Inchon on September 15, 1950, which would completely change the strategic situation by cutting North Korean supply lines and threatening the North Korean forces around Pusan with encirclement and destruction. The successful defense of the Pusan perimeter was absolutely critical to the survival of South Korea and the eventual UN victory in the first phase of the war, as failure to hold this position would have meant the complete conquest of South Korea by North Korean forces, and would have presented the United States and United Nations with the much more difficult task of mounting an amphibious invasion to recapture the peninsula, and the successful holding of this perimeter remains one of the most important defensive achievements in American military history, and a crucial turning point in the Korean War that prevented the complete communist conquest of the peninsula and made possible everything that followed. The Inchon Landing. The Inchon Landing, executed on September 15, 1950, represents one of the most audacious and brilliant amphibious operations in military history, a bold strategic masterstroke conceived and championed by General Douglas MacArthur that completely reversed the course of the Korean War and transformed what had appeared to be an imminent United Nations defeat into a stunning victory that would liberate South Korea and drive North Korean forces back across the 38th parallel within weeks. The operation, codenamed Operation Chromite, involved landing approximately 75,000 United Nations troops, primarily U.S. Marines and Army units, at the port city of Inchon on the western coast of Korea, approximately 25 miles west of Seoul and more than 150 miles behind North Korean lines, with the strategic objective of cutting North Korean supply lines, recapturing Seoul, and trapping the North Korean forces that were besieging the Pusan perimeter in the south between two advancing UN forces that would crush them in a massive encirclement. MacArthur had been planning an amphibious counteroffensive almost from the moment North Korean forces invaded in June, recognizing that the elongated geography of the Korean Peninsula, with its extensive coastlines on both the Yellow Sea to the west and the Sea of Japan to the east, provided opportunities for amphibious operations that could exploit UN naval superiority and bypass North Korean strength on land, and he quickly fixed upon Inchon as the optimal landing site, despite the enormous technical and logistical challenges that such an operation would entail. The choice of Inchon was extraordinarily risky and was opposed by virtually all of MacArthur's subordinate commanders, naval officers, and even many officials in Washington, who argued that the location presented nearly insurmountable obstacles that made it perhaps the worst possible site for an amphibious landing anywhere in the world. Inchon's tides were among the most extreme on Earth, with a tidal range of approximately 32 feet between high and low tide, meaning that landing craft could only approach the beaches during a brief window at high tide, and if the landings were delayed or took longer than planned, the receding tide would strand vessels on mudflats, where they would be helpless targets for North Korean artillery. The approaches to Inchon were through narrow, winding channels that were poorly charted and potentially mined, requiring the invasion fleet to navigate these treacherous waters in precise formation, while vulnerable to coastal batteries and potential North Korean defensive positions. The beaches themselves were not beaches in the traditional sense, but rather sea walls and urban waterfront areas that would require troops to scale walls, using ladders immediately upon landing, rather than crossing open beaches where they could establish a beachhead more gradually. The city of Inchon was built up and urbanized, meaning that once ashore, troops would need to fight through streets and buildings rather than having room to maneuver and deploy their forces in open terrain. Furthermore, intelligence about North Korean defensive positions around Inchon was limited and uncertain, raising the possibility that landing forces might encounter much stronger resistance than anticipated. Despite these formidable obstacles and the near-universal skepticism of his subordinates and superiors, MacArthur insisted that Inchon was the right choice, precisely because it was so unexpected and risky, arguing that the North Koreans would never anticipate a landing at such a difficult location and would therefore not defend it heavily, and that the strategic benefits of landing near Seoul and cutting North Korean supply lines far outweighed the tactical risks of the operation. In a famous meeting at Tokyo on August 23, 1950, MacArthur presented his case for the Inchon operation to skeptical Navy and Marine Corps commanders and representatives from Washington, delivering a passionate and eloquent defense of his plan, in which he acknowledged all the difficulties but argued that surprise and audacity would overcome them, famously concluding his presentation by saying that the very arguments made against the operation were the reasons it would succeed, because the enemy would not expect an attack at such an improbable location. MacArthur's force of personality, his reputation from World War II, and the desperate situation at Pusan, which demanded some kind of dramatic action to break the stalemate, eventually won approval for the operation, despite continued reservations from many participants. The actual landing operation on September 15 began with preliminary naval and air bombardments of Inchon and the island of Wolmi-do, which dominated the harbor approaches, and at 6:30 in the morning, Marines landed on Wolmi-do against light resistance, securing the island and its commanding heights by mid-morning, and allowing the main landings to proceed as planned. The main assault began in the afternoon with the evening high tide, as the 1st Marine Division came ashore at 2 different landing zones, Red Beach in the northern part of Inchon and Blue Beach in the south, scaling the sea walls, using ladders as they had trained to do, and quickly pushing inland, despite some North Korean resistance that was far lighter than had been feared. MacArthur's assessment that Inchon would be lightly defended proved correct, as North Korean forces had concentrated their strength in the south around Pusan and had left only small garrison forces in the Incheon-Seoul area, never imagining that UN forces would attempt such a risky landing so far behind their lines. By nightfall, on September 15, the Marines had secured a beachhead in Inchon and were beginning to push inland toward Seoul. And over the following days, additional waves of Marines and Army units landed at Inchon, building up the invasion force and expanding the beachhead while encountering increasingly stiff North Korean resistance as enemy forces rushed to defend Seoul and prevent the UN advance. The drive from Inchon to Seoul took approximately 2 weeks of hard fighting as North Korean forces, recognizing the catastrophic threat posed by the Inchon Landing, threw together defensive positions around the capital and fought desperately to hold the city, turning Seoul into a battleground where Marines and Army units had to fight block by block and building by building to clear North Korean defenders who showed remarkable determination despite their increasingly hopeless strategic situation. The battle for Seoul was costly and destructive, reducing much of the city to rubble and causing thousands of civilian casualties. But by September 28, just 13 days after the Inchon landing, UN forces had recaptured Seoul, and MacArthur conducted a ceremony restoring Syngman-rhee and the South Korean government to their capital. Meanwhile, the strategic effects of the Inchon landing had been even more dramatic than MacArthur had predicted, as North Korean forces besieging the Pusan perimeter suddenly found their supply lines cut, their rear areas threatened, and their entire army in danger of being trapped in southern Korea. And North Korean units began withdrawing northward in increasingly chaotic disorder, attempting to escape the closing trap, but suffering enormous casualties as UN forces broke out of the Pusan perimeter on September 16 and began pursuing the retreating North Koreans, while the Inchon force advanced from the opposite direction. The Inchon landing vindicated MacArthur's strategic vision and restored his reputation as one of history's great military commanders, demonstrating that bold and imaginative leadership could overcome apparently insurmountable obstacles and achieve decisive results. And the operation became a textbook example of how amphibious power and strategic mobility could be used to outmaneuver an enemy and achieve victory against numerically superior forces. However, the very success of Inchon and the rapid collapse of North Korean resistance would also contribute to the fateful decision to cross the 38th parallel and advance into North Korea in pursuit of complete victory, reunification of Korea under UN auspices, a decision that would bring Chinese intervention and transform the limited war to restore South Korea into a much larger and ultimately inconclusive conflict that would drag on for nearly 3 more years. The Inchon landing thus represents both MacArthur's greatest triumph in Korea and, paradoxically, the beginning of a chain of events that would lead to his greatest failure, when his confidence from Inchon led him to underestimate the possibility of Chinese intervention and to advance his forces too close to the Chinese border, setting the stage for the massive Chinese counteroffensive that would once again reverse the war's momentum and drive UN forces back down the peninsula in chaotic retreat during the winter of 1950 to 1951. March to the Yalu and Chinese intervention. The march to the Yalu River and subsequent Chinese intervention represents one of the most dramatic reversals of fortune in military history and marks the moment when the Korean War transformed from what appeared to be a successful United Nations campaign to reunify Korea under democratic rule into a much larger, more dangerous, and ultimately stalemated conflict that would drag on for nearly 3 more years and nearly trigger World War III. Following the spectacular success of the Inchon landing on September 15, 1950, and the subsequent breakout from the Pusan perimeter, North Korean forces collapsed with stunning rapidity, retreating northward in disarray as United Nations forces advanced up the peninsula in pursuit, recapturing Seoul by late September and reaching the 38th parallel, the original border between North and South Korea, by early October 1950. At this point, UN forces faced a critical strategic decision about whether to halt at the 38th parallel, having achieved the original objective of repelling North Korean aggression and restoring South Korean sovereignty, or whether to continue the advance into North Korea with the more ambitious goal of destroying the North Korean regime entirely and reunifying the peninsula under South Korean control. The Truman administration, emboldened by the success at Inchon and influenced by political pressures at home, where Republicans were demanding complete victory and questioning why the United States should settle for merely restoring the status quo ante bellum, when total victory seemed within reach, decided to authorize MacArthur to cross the 38th parallel and continue the offensive into North Korea, with the crucial caveat that he should not approach too close to the Chinese or Soviet borders and should use only South Korean forces in the regions immediately adjacent to those borders to minimize the risk of provoking Chinese or Soviet intervention. On October 7, 1950, UN forces crossed the 38th parallel and began advancing into North Korea, encountering relatively light resistance as demoralized North Korean forces continued their retreat northward toward the Chinese border, and by mid-October, UN forces had captured Pyongyang, the North Korean capital, and were advancing rapidly toward the Yalu River, which formed the border between North Korea and China. MacArthur, convinced that the war was essentially won and that North Korean forces were no longer capable of organized resistance, pressed his forces to advance as quickly as possible to reach the Yalu River and complete the destruction of the North Korean regime before winter weather made operations more difficult. And in his optimism and confidence following the Inchon success, he dismissed or minimized intelligence reports and warnings suggesting that Chinese forces were massing north of the Yalu River and might intervene if UN forces continued their advance toward the Chinese border. The Chinese government under Mao Zedong had been watching the UN advance with growing alarm and had repeatedly signaled through various diplomatic channels, including statements by Chinese Foreign Minister Zhou Enlai and messages passed through third parties, that China would not tolerate UN forces approaching the Chinese border and would intervene militarily if necessary to protect Chinese security interests and preserve North Korea as a buffer state between China and UN forces. However, these warnings were either not taken seriously by MacArthur and American officials who doubted Chinese willingness and capability to intervene in force, or were interpreted as bluffs designed to deter the UN advance without any genuine intention to follow through with military action. MacArthur's confidence that China would not intervene was based on several assumptions that would prove tragically mistaken, including his belief that China was too weak militarily and too preoccupied with internal reconstruction after years of civil war to mount a major military operation in Korea, his assessment that American air power would be able to destroy any Chinese forces attempting to cross the Yalu River and enter North Korea, making intervention militarily futile, and his conviction that Chinese leaders were rational actors who would recognize that intervention would be suicidal, given American military superiority and the possibility of nuclear retaliation. In mid-October, Truman flew to Wake Island in the Pacific to meet with MacArthur and discuss the war's progress and future course, and during this meeting, MacArthur assured the president that victory was near, that the war would be over by Thanksgiving, and that the chances of Chinese or Soviet intervention were minimal, with MacArthur famously stating that if the Chinese tried to intervene, there would be the greatest slaughter, as American air power destroyed them. Reassured by MacArthur's confidence, Truman returned to Washington and allowed the advance to continue, though he remained somewhat uneasy about the risks of Chinese intervention and the possibility that the war might expand beyond Korea. In late October 1950, as UN forces approached the Yalu River, Chinese forces began crossing the border into North Korea in massive numbers, with hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers, officially designated as volunteers, to maintain the fiction that China was not formally at war with the United Nations, infiltrating into the mountainous regions of northern Korea under cover of darkness and concealing themselves during daylight hours to avoid detection by UN aircraft. The first encounters between UN forces and Chinese troops occurred in late October, with Chinese forces launching sudden attacks against South Korean and American units in several locations, inflicting significant casualties before withdrawing back into the mountains. And these initial clashes provided clear evidence that Chinese forces were present in Korea in substantial numbers, but MacArthur and his intelligence staff significantly underestimated the scale of Chinese intervention, believing that only relatively small numbers of Chinese troops had crossed the border and that they did not represent a serious threat to UN operations. This massive intelligence failure, resulting from a combination of MacArthur's overconfidence, the effectiveness of Chinese operational security and camouflage techniques that concealed their troop movements from aerial observation, and perhaps wishful thinking by UN commanders who did not want to believe that their victory was about to be snatched away, meant that UN forces continued advancing toward the Yalu River in late November, without adequate precautions or preparations for the massive Chinese offensive that was about to engulf them. On November 25, 1950, Chinese forces launched a massive, coordinated offensive involving approximately 300,000 troops attacking UN forces across a broad front in northern Korea, striking with overwhelming force against surprised and often isolated UN units that were strung out along extended supply lines in mountainous terrain that favored the attacking Chinese forces. The Chinese offensive achieved complete surprise and tactical superiority despite the warnings that had been available, and UN forces, particularly the 8th Army in the western part of North Korea, and the 10th Corps, including the 1st Marine Division in the eastern mountains around the Chosin Reservoir, suddenly found themselves fighting for survival against an enemy that vastly outnumbered them and had seized the initiative through surprise and superior tactical positioning. The Chinese attacks were characterized by massive infantry assaults launched at night, with Chinese troops moving cross-country through mountainous terrain that UN forces had assumed was impassable, surrounding UN positions with superior numbers, and attacking with bugles, whistles, and overwhelming firepower that created panic and confusion among UN forces who suddenly realized they were facing not the defeated remnants of the North Korean army, but a fresh, numerous, and highly motivated enemy. The 8th Army in Western Korea began retreating southward in increasing disorder as Chinese forces threatened to cut off and destroy entire divisions, and what had been a confident advance toward final victory suddenly became a desperate fighting retreat as UN forces struggled to avoid encirclement and destruction while withdrawing southward through difficult terrain and brutal winter weather that added to their casualties and misery. The Chinese intervention completely transformed the Korean War, shattering MacArthur's predictions of quick victory, demonstrating the limitations of American military power when confronted with an enemy willing to accept enormous casualties and possessing advantages in numbers and familiarity with the terrain, and raising the terrifying prospect that the conflict might escalate into a general war between the United States and China that could potentially draw in the Soviet Union and result in World War III, with the possibility of nuclear weapons being used. The march to the Yalu, which had seemed like the final triumphant phase of a successful campaign to reunify Korea, instead became remembered as an example of strategic overreach, intelligence failure, and the dangers of underestimating an adversary. And the Chinese intervention would force UN forces into a long, costly retreat back down the peninsula, ultimately stabilizing roughly along the 38th parallel where the war had begun, leading to 2 more years of grinding stalemate before an armistice was finally signed in July 1953, leaving Korea divided essentially where it had been before the war started, and transforming what might have been a relatively quick and decisive UN victory into one of the most frustrating and costly conflicts in American history. US-China relations transformed. The Chinese intervention in the Korean War fundamentally and permanently transformed US-China relations, converting what had been a complex and evolving relationship marked by both cooperation and competition into an implacable hostility that would last for more than 2 decades and shape the entire structure of Cold War politics in Asia and beyond. Prior to the Korean War, American policy toward China had been confused and contradictory, struggling to adjust to the reality of the communist victory in the Chinese Civil War that culminated in October 1949 when Mao Zedong proclaimed the establishment of the People's Republic of China in Beijing, while the nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek fled to Taiwan, and while the Truman administration had essentially written off the nationalist cause as hopeless during the final stages of the Civil War and had issued a white paper in August 1949 explaining why the United States had not intervened more forcefully to prevent the communist victory, American policy toward the new communist government remained uncertain, with some officials arguing for eventual recognition and accommodation of Communist China as the de facto government of the world's most populous nation, while others advocated continued support for the nationalist regime on Taiwan and complete rejection of any relationship with the Beijing government. The outbreak of the Korean War initially seemed to clarify American policy in favor of the anti-communist position, as Truman immediately ordered the Seventh Fleet to patrol the Taiwan Strait to prevent either a communist invasion of Taiwan or nationalist attacks on the mainland, effectively interposing American military power between the two Chinese governments and committing the United States to the defense of Taiwan. But the possibility remained that if the Korean conflict could be resolved without direct confrontation with China, some eventual normalization of relations might still be possible as pragmatic considerations overcame ideological hostility. The massive Chinese intervention in late November 1950, involving hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops attacking American and other UN forces, killing thousands of American soldiers, and driving UN forces into headlong retreat down the Korean Peninsula, transformed American public and official opinion toward China in profound and lasting ways that made any rapprochement impossible for a generation. The fact that American soldiers were now dying in combat against Chinese forces created a powerful emotional and political dynamic that made China an enemy in American consciousness in ways that went beyond the ideological opposition to communism and created personal and national grievances that would not easily be forgotten or forgiven, and the shock of the Chinese intervention, coming after MacArthur's assurances that China would not intervene, and his confident predictions of victory by Thanksgiving, created a sense of betrayal and humiliation that intensified American hostility toward the Beijing government. The Truman administration, which had been relatively restrained in its rhetoric toward Communist China before the intervention, now adopted a position of complete hostility, characterizing China as an aggressor nation, supporting United Nations resolutions, condemning Chinese intervention, imposing comprehensive economic sanctions and trade embargoes against China, and committing itself fully to the defense and support of the nationalist government on Taiwan as the legitimate government of all China, a position that would remain official American policy for more than 2 decades, until Richard Nixon's opening to China in 1972. The Korean War fighting between American and Chinese forces was brutal and costly, with both sides suffering enormous casualties in combat that ranged across the mountainous Korean terrain through 2 bitter winters, and the experience of fighting Chinese forces created lasting impressions and attitudes among American military personnel and political leaders that would influence American policy for decades, including a tendency to see China as irrationally aggressive, willing to accept unlimited casualties in pursuit of its objectives, contemptuous of human life in ways that Western nations were not, and fundamentally hostile to American interests throughout Asia and the world. The fact that the war eventually stalemated roughly along the 38th parallel after the initial Chinese offensive pushed UN forces back from the Yalu River meant that neither side achieved decisive victory, and the armistice, signed in July 1953, left both American and Chinese forces claiming some success while acknowledging that neither had been able to achieve their maximal objectives. But the war's outcome reinforced mutual hostility and suspicion rather than creating any basis for reconciliation or improved relations. The experience of fighting each other in Korea convinced American officials that China under communist leadership represented a major threat to American interests in Asia that needed to be contained through military alliances, bases, and forward deployments of American forces, leading to the creation of a network of American alliances and security commitments throughout East and Southeast Asia, including the U.S. Japan Security Treaty, the U.S. South Korea Mutual Defense Treaty, the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, and bilateral security relationships with Taiwan, the Philippines, Thailand, and other nations, all designed to create a containment perimeter around China and prevent further communist expansion in Asia. The transformation of U.S.-China relations during and after the Korean War also had profound effects on Chinese foreign policy and domestic politics, as the experience of fighting the United States reinforced Mao Zedong's revolutionary ideology and his conviction that imperialism led by the United States represented the primary threat to China and to revolutionary movements throughout the developing world. And the Korean War became a central element in Chinese communist mythology, as proof that China, under communist leadership, could stand up to and fight the world's most powerful nation to a draw, restoring Chinese national pride after a century of humiliation by foreign powers. The comprehensive American economic embargo and diplomatic isolation imposed on China after the Korean intervention forced China into even closer dependence on the Soviet Union than might otherwise have been the case, as China needed Soviet economic assistance, military equipment, and technical expertise to sustain its development and defense capabilities, and this dependence on Moscow shaped Chinese policy throughout the 1950s, even though tensions between Beijing and Moscow would eventually emerge and lead to the Sino-Soviet split by the early 1960s. The American commitment to Taiwan's defense and refusal to recognize the Beijing government meant that China was denied its seat in the United Nations, with the nationalist government on Taiwan continuing to hold China's permanent seat on the Security Council until 1971, creating a situation that the Beijing government regarded as a fundamental injustice, and that became a constant source of friction in international politics throughout the 1950s and 1960s. The hostile U.S.-China relationship that emerged from the Korean War created a structure of confrontation in Asia that would persist for more than 2 decades, influencing American involvement in Vietnam, where fear of Chinese intervention similar to Korea was a constant concern that shaped American strategy and limitations on military operations, contributing to Cold War crises over Taiwan in 1954 to 1955 and 1958, when Chinese communist forces bombarded nationalist-held islands and the United States threatened military action to defend them, and preventing any significant diplomatic, economic, or cultural contact between the United States and China for more than 20 years after the Korean Armistice. The domestic political impact in the United States was equally significant, as the loss of China and the subsequent Korean War fighting created a political climate that empowered anti-communist hardliners, contributed to the rise of MacArthyism, and the persecution of State Department officials and others who were accused of being soft on communism or somehow responsible for communist victories in Asia, and created political constraints that made it virtually impossible for any American administration to consider recognizing Communist China or adopting more flexible policies toward Beijing without facing devastating political attacks from conservative critics. It was not until the early 1970s, after more than 2 decades of hostility and isolation, that the transformation in U.S.-China relations that had been created by the Korean War began to be reversed through Nixon's historic visit to China in 1972 and the gradual normalization of relations that followed. But even then, the memory of American and Chinese soldiers fighting and dying in Korea remained a powerful legacy that complicated the relationship and reminded both sides of how quickly cooperation could turn into violent confrontation when vital interests collided. Stalemate and trench warfare. The period of stalemate and trench warfare in the Korean War, which lasted from roughly mid-1951 through the Armistice signing in July 1953, represents one of the most frustrating and costly phases of the conflict, a time when both sides abandoned hopes for decisive military victory and settled into a grinding war of attrition reminiscent of World War I, with soldiers fighting and dying over hills and ridgelines that often had no strategic value beyond their usefulness as bargaining chips in the Armistice Negotiations that dragged on interminably while the killing continued. This phase of the war began after the dramatic reversals of 1950 and early 1951, during which UN forces had advanced to the Yalu River following the Inchon Landing, then been driven back by massive Chinese intervention in late November and December 1950, and then counterattacked again in spring 1951 to stabilize a line roughly along the 38th parallel where the war had originally begun. And by mid-1951, it had become clear to commanders on both sides that neither possessed the capability to achieve a decisive breakthrough that would lead to total victory without accepting casualties and risks that their governments were unwilling to bear. The military situation stabilized along a front that stretched approximately 150 miles across the Korean Peninsula from coast to coast, generally following terrain features like rivers and mountain ridges, with both sides constructing elaborate defensive fortifications including bunkers, trenches, barbed wire obstacles, minefields, and artillery positions that turned the front line into a heavily fortified zone, where any attack would face devastating defensive firepower, and where gains would be measured in yards rather than miles, and would cost hundreds or thousands of casualties for objectives whose capture would not significantly alter the overall strategic situation. The decision by both sides to settle into static defensive warfare rather than continuing to seek decisive victory through mobile operations reflected several factors, including the exhaustion of forces on both sides after nearly a year of intense combat, the recognition that further offensive operations would require massive reinforcements and would risk expanding the war geographically and potentially bringing in additional powers, including possibly the Soviet Union, the calculation that the costs of continuing offensive operations would exceed any likely benefits, and most importantly, and the beginning of Armistice Negotiations in July 1951, which created a situation where both sides were simultaneously fighting and negotiating, using military operations to strengthen their bargaining positions at the negotiating table while avoiding the kind of all-out offensives that might derail the peace talks entirely. The Armistice Negotiations, which began at Kaesong and later moved to Panmunjom, a small village in the demilitarized zone between the two armies, became the longest negotiating process in modern military history, dragging on for more than 2 years while soldiers continued to fight and die along the front lines, and the glacial pace of these negotiations, which became bogged down in endless disputes over technical issues like the exact location of the ceasefire line, the repatriation of prisoners of war, and supervisory mechanisms to ensure compliance with any armistice agreement, meant that military operations continued throughout this entire period with no end in sight, and with soldiers on both sides becoming increasingly cynical about the purposes for which they were fighting and dying. The fighting during the stalemate period took on a distinctive character that differed markedly from the mobile warfare of 1950, with both sides conducting limited objective attacks designed to capture specific hill positions or sections of the enemy's defensive line, improving their tactical positions and demonstrating their continued will to fight, but without attempting the kind of broad offensive operations that might have led to a breakthrough or dramatic change in the military situation. These limited attacks, which had names like Old Baldy, Porkchop Hill, Heartbreak Ridge, Bloody Ridge, and The Hook, became legendary in military history for the ferocity of the fighting and the disproportionate casualties inflicted relative to the minimal strategic value of the terrain being contested, with some positions changing hands multiple times as attack and counterattack followed one another in deadly succession, and soldiers on both sides came to question the sanity of dying for hills that would likely be abandoned or returned in any final peace settlement. The artillery duel between the two sides became almost continuous, with both UN and communist forces deploying massive numbers of artillery pieces that fired thousands of rounds daily at enemy positions, trenches, supply routes, and suspected concentration areas, and the constant bombardment created a hellish environment for soldiers in the front lines who lived in bunkers and trenches, enduring the psychological stress of constant shelling while waiting for orders to attack enemy positions or defend against enemy assaults. The experience of soldiers during the stalemate period was particularly difficult because, unlike the mobile warfare of earlier phases, where there was at least the sense of advancing or retreating with some clear military purpose, the static warfare meant that soldiers occupied the same positions for weeks or months, living in primitive conditions in trenches and bunkers, subjected to enemy artillery fire and sniper attacks, conducting nighttime patrols into no man's land between the lines, and periodically being ordered to attack heavily defended enemy positions in assaults that everyone knew would be costly and would likely achieve only temporary gains before the position was abandoned or lost to counterattack. The winter conditions in Korea, with temperatures often dropping well below 0 Fahrenheit and heavy snow making movement difficult and increasing the misery of soldiers living in exposed positions, added another dimension of suffering to the experience of frontline troops, and frostbite became a major cause of casualties during the winter months of 1951 to 1952 and 1952 to 1953, sometimes causing more losses than enemy action. The rotation system implemented by the U.S. military, which returned soldiers home after serving a specified period in Korea, rather than keeping units in combat for the duration of the war, meant that individual soldiers could count down the days until their rotation date and departure from Korea, but this system also created problems with unit cohesion and morale, as experienced soldiers departed and were replaced by newcomers who had to learn combat skills in the dangerous environment of the front lines, and the knowledge that the war had become stalemated and that no decisive victory was likely made. It even harder for soldiers to understand why they should risk their lives in this apparently pointless continuation of combat. The air war continued throughout the stalemate period, with UN forces maintaining air superiority and conducting continuous bombing campaigns against North Korean and Chinese supply lines, transportation networks, industrial facilities, and military installations, and American aircraft, including B-29 bombers and fighter bombers, flew thousands of sorties, attempting to interdict enemy supplies and reinforcements moving toward the front lines, though the effectiveness of this air campaign was limited by the enemy's ability to move supplies at night, to disperse and camouflage installations, and to repair damage quickly using massive labor forces. The introduction of Soviet MiG-15 jet fighters, flown by Chinese and possibly Soviet pilots, created challenges for UN air superiority, particularly in the area near the Yalu River that became known as MiG Alley, where American F-86 Sabre jets engaged in dogfights with MiG-15s in some of the first jet-versus-jet aerial combat in history. And while American pilots maintained a favorable kill ratio, the presence of modern Soviet aircraft demonstrated that the communists possessed sophisticated military technology and were willing to escalate their commitment to the war if necessary. The prisoner of war issue became one of the most contentious problems in the Armistice Negotiations, with the communist side demanding that all prisoners be returned automatically, regardless of their wishes, while the United States and its allies insisted on voluntary repatriation, allowing prisoners to choose whether to return to communist control or to remain in South Korea or go to Taiwan. And this issue deadlocked negotiations for more than a year, because significant numbers of Chinese and North Korean prisoners indicated they would refuse repatriation, creating a propaganda problem for the communist governments who could not accept that their soldiers would voluntarily choose not to return home. The stalemate finally began to break in 1953, following the death of Soviet leader Joseph Stalin in March, which may have reduced Soviet commitment to continuing the war and increased Chinese willingness to accept an armistice, and following strong pressure from the Eisenhower administration, which had taken office in January 1953 with promises to end the Korean War, and which may have signaled through diplomatic channels that it was prepared to use nuclear weapons or expand the war if negotiations did not produce results. After 2 years and 17 days of negotiations, an armistice agreement was finally signed on July 27, 1953, establishing a ceasefire, creating a demilitarized zone along the front line where fighting stopped, and providing for the exchange of prisoners, but notably not including a formal peace treaty or any final resolution of the political issues that had caused the war, leaving Korea divided and technically still at war more than 70 years later. And the stalemate period that had dominated the final 2 years of the war represented a frustrating and costly conclusion to a conflict that had cost millions of lives and devastated the Korean Peninsula without achieving any decisive resolution of the fundamental conflicts that had sparked the war. Truman versus MacArthur clash. The clash between President Harry Truman and General Douglas MacArthur represents one of the most dramatic confrontations in American history between civilian and military authority, culminating in MacArthur's dismissal on April 11, 1951, and raising fundamental constitutional questions about the proper relationship between the president as commander-in-chief and military commanders in the field, as well as the appropriate limits on military officers commenting publicly on political and strategic matters when their views conflict with administration policy. The conflict between Truman and MacArthur had been building throughout the Korean War as the two men, both strong-willed and confident in their own judgment, clashed over strategy, the conduct of operations, and the broader purposes for which the war was being fought, with MacArthur consistently advocating for a more aggressive approach, including potential attacks on China itself, the use of nationalist Chinese forces from Taiwan in combat operations, and possibly the use of nuclear weapons, while Truman and his civilian advisors sought to keep the war limited to the Korean Peninsula and avoid escalation that might trigger World War III with the Soviet Union. MacArthur, who at age 70 had already achieved legendary status through his military career, spanning back to World War I, and including his roles as Supreme Commander in the Southwest Pacific during World War II, and as the architect of Japan's post-war reconstruction, possessed enormous prestige and self-confidence that made him resistant to direction from Washington and convinced of his own strategic vision, and he had long chafed at what he perceived as excessive political interference in military matters and insufficient commitment to achieving total victory in Korea. The immediate trigger for MacArthur's dismissal came after a series of incidents in which he publicly contradicted administration policy and made statements that undermined Truman's diplomatic efforts to negotiate an end to the war, most notably when MacArthur issued his own unauthorized statement on March 24, 1951, essentially offering peace terms to China and threatening to expand the war if those terms were rejected, undercutting a planned presidential initiative to begin armistice discussions and demonstrating that MacArthur was conducting his own foreign policy rather than implementing the president's directives. This was followed by MacArthur's letter to Republican House Minority Leader Joseph Martin, which Martin read on the floor of Congress on April 5, 1951, in which MacArthur criticized the administration's policy of limited war, argued that there is no substitute for victory, and suggested that failing to pursue total victory against communism in Asia was a fundamental strategic error, and this public airing of his disagreements with administration policy through a Republican opposition leader was the final straw for Truman, who concluded that MacArthur had to be relieved because he could no longer trust the general to implement presidential directives, and because MacArthur's public statements were creating confusion about who was actually directing American policy. Truman's decision to fire MacArthur was supported by his key civilian advisors, including Secretary of State Dean Acheson and Secretary of Defense George Marshall, and importantly, by the Joint Chiefs of Staff who, while respecting MacArthur's military achievements, agreed that his insubordination and public challenges to policy could not be tolerated regardless of his stature. And on April 11, Truman announced MacArthur's relief from all his commands, replacing him with General Matthew Ridgway, who had performed brilliantly commanding the 8th Army during the difficult winter of 1950 to 1951. The public reaction to MacArthur's dismissal was explosive and revealed deep divisions in American society about the conduct of the war and appropriate civil-military relations, with MacArthur returning to the United States for the first time in 14 years to receive a hero's welcome, addressing a joint session of Congress in an emotional speech in which he defended his positions and concluded with his famous line, "Old soldiers never die, they just fade away." While millions of Americans watched or listened to his appearances, and many expressed outrage at what they saw as Truman's unjust treatment of a great American hero. Congressional hearings were held to investigate the circumstances of MacArthur's dismissal and to air the strategic debates about how the war should be conducted, with MacArthur testifying at length about his views and criticizing the administration's policy of limited war. But as the hearings progressed, and administration officials, including the Joint Chiefs, testified about the risks of MacArthur's proposed strategy and the importance of civilian control over military policy, public opinion gradually shifted toward support for Truman's decision, and MacArthur's political moment passed as Americans came to accept that regardless of MacArthur's military brilliance, the principle that civilian leadership must control military policy was more important than any individual general's views. The Truman-MacArthur clash established important precedents about civil-military relations in American democracy, reaffirming the constitutional principle that the president as commander-in-chief has ultimate authority over military strategy and operations, and that military officers, regardless of their rank or prestige, must either implement presidential policy or resign rather than publicly opposing and undermining that policy. And while MacArthur's relief was politically costly for Truman in the short term, it was widely recognized by historians and constitutional scholars as necessary to preserve civilian control of the military and to prevent the dangerous precedent of military commanders conducting their own foreign and military policy, independent of presidential direction, making the incident a defining moment in understanding the proper relationship between civilian and military authority in American constitutional democracy. Armistice Negotiations. The Armistice Negotiations that eventually ended the fighting in the Korean War represent one of the longest and most frustrating diplomatic processes in modern military history, lasting more than 2 years from their beginning in July 1951 until the final agreement was signed on July 27, 1953, during which time thousands of soldiers on both sides continued to fight and die for marginal territorial gains, while diplomats argued over technical details and fundamental disagreements that seemed almost impossible to resolve. The negotiations began in early July 1951, after the military situation had stabilized along a front roughly following the 38th parallel, with both sides recognizing that neither possessed the capability to achieve decisive military victory without accepting costs and risks that their governments were unwilling to bear, and the initial meetings were held at Kaesong, a city in North Korean territory, before later moving to Panmunjom, a small village in the no-man's land between the two armies that would become synonymous with the negotiations and eventually the site of the demilitarized zone. The negotiating teams consisted of military officers rather than civilian diplomats, with the United Nations Command delegation led initially by Vice Admiral C. Turner Joy and later by other senior officers, while the Communist delegation included representatives from North Korea and China, who ostensibly negotiated as equals with the UN side, but whose positions were actually determined by higher authorities in Beijing, Moscow, and Pyongyang, who used the negotiations as much for propaganda purposes as for genuinely seeking agreement. The negotiations quickly became bogged down in procedural disputes and fundamental disagreements about the agenda, the location and conduct of meetings, and eventually, the substantive issues that needed to be resolved before fighting could end, with the communist side employing tactics of delay, propaganda speeches, and manufactured incidents designed to frustrate the UN negotiators and score political points with international and domestic audiences, while the UN side struggled with the challenge of negotiating with an adversary whose decision-making processes were opaque and whose negotiating positions seemed to change without explanation or logic. The two most difficult and time-consuming issues in the negotiations were the location of the final ceasefire line that would separate the two sides and become the basis for the demilitarized zone and the procedures for handling prisoners of war, with both issues deadlocking negotiations for many months and requiring numerous compromises and creative solutions before agreement could be reached. The ceasefire line issue was contentious because the communist side initially insisted that the line should follow the 38th parallel regardless of where forces were actually positioned when fighting stopped, while the UN side argued that the line should follow the actual front line at the time of armistice, which ran north of the 38th parallel in some areas and south of it in others, and this dispute was eventually resolved by agreeing that the ceasefire line would follow the actual line of contact at the time the armistice was signed, creating incentives for both sides to launch limited offensives to improve their positions before the final agreement. The prisoner of war issue proved even more difficult and ultimately delayed the armistice for more than a year, as the communist side demanded that all prisoners be automatically returned to their home countries, regardless of their individual wishes, following traditional practice in previous wars where prisoners were exchanged automatically once fighting ended, while the United States insisted on voluntary repatriation that would allow prisoners to choose whether to return to communist control or remain in South Korea or go to Taiwan, motivated partly by humanitarian concerns, but also by the propaganda value of demonstrating that significant numbers of Chinese and North Korean soldiers preferred not to return to communist rule. The screening of prisoners revealed that approximately 70,000 of the roughly 130,000 communist prisoners in UN custody indicated they would refuse repatriation if given the choice, creating an enormous political and propaganda problem for the communist governments who could not accept that tens of thousands of their soldiers would voluntarily choose not to return home, and this issue deadlocked negotiations throughout 1952, despite various proposals for compromise, including neutral nation supervision of prisoner screening and repatriation processes. The negotiations were further complicated by incidents including prisoner uprisings in UN prisoner of war camps that resulted in casualties and intensified communist propaganda about alleged mistreatment of prisoners, and by South Korean President Syngman Rhee's opposition to any armistice that would leave Korea divided, with Rhee threatening to continue fighting even if an armistice was signed, and actually releasing thousands of North Korean prisoners in June 1953 in an attempt to sabotage the negotiations. The breakthrough that finally led to an armistice came in 1953, following several significant changes in the political context, including the death of Soviet leader Joseph Stalin in March 1953, which may have reduced Soviet commitment to continuing the war, the inauguration of President Dwight Eisenhower in January 1953, with his campaign promise to end the Korean War and possible signals through diplomatic channels that the United States was prepared to use nuclear weapons or expand the war if negotiations did not succeed, and Chinese exhaustion with the enormous costs of continuing the war in terms of casualties and economic resources, after further intense negotiations over the prisoner issue, eventually resolved through a compromise involving a neutral nations repatriation commission that would supervise prisoners who refused immediate repatriation and give them additional time to decide their fate. The Armistice Agreement was finally signed on July 27, 1953, establishing a ceasefire, creating a demilitarized zone approximately 2.5 miles wide along the front line, providing for the withdrawal of forces from this zone, establishing a mechanism for supervising the armistice through a military armistice commission, and arranging for prisoner exchanges, but notably not including any political settlement of the issues that had caused the war or any formal peace treaty, leaving Korea divided and technically at war to this day. Cost of war. The cost of the Korean War in human lives, physical destruction, economic, resources, and long-term social and political consequences was staggering and devastating, making it one of the deadliest conflicts of the 20th century. Despite its relatively short 3-year duration from June 1950 to July 1953, and the war's impact continues to reverberate through Korean society and international relations more than 70 years after the armistice brought an end to active fighting. The human toll of the war was enormous and remains difficult to calculate precisely due to incomplete records, the chaos of combat, and disputes over casualty figures, but scholarly estimates suggest that total military and civilian deaths across all sides exceeded 3 million people, with some estimates ranging even higher to 3.5 or 4 million, when including deaths from disease, starvation, and exposure that resulted indirectly from the war's disruption of society and economy. Military casualties were heavy on all sides, with approximately 36,000 American service members killed in action or dying from wounds or other causes during the war, while over 90,000 were wounded and several thousand were captured and held as prisoners of war, many enduring brutal conditions in North Korean and Chinese prison camps, where disease, malnutrition, and mistreatment caused additional deaths. South Korean military casualties were even more severe, with estimates suggesting that approximately 137,000 South Korean soldiers were killed, over 450,000 wounded, and tens of thousands missing or captured during the conflict, representing devastating losses for a nation with a relatively small population. North Korean military casualties are less reliably documented, but are estimated at approximately 215,000 killed and 300,000 wounded, though some estimates place the figures even higher, while Chinese casualties were enormous due to their contre-war tactics of mass infantry assaults and their willingness to accept huge losses to achieve military objectives, with estimates of Chinese deaths ranging from 180,000 to 400,000, depending on the source, and Chinese wounded numbering in the hundreds of thousands, making the Korean War one of the costliest military operations in Chinese history, despite its relatively brief duration. The civilian toll was catastrophic and may have exceeded military casualties, as the war devastated the entire Korean Peninsula through bombing campaigns, artillery bombardments, ground combat that swept back and forth across the country multiple times, and deliberate massacres and atrocities committed by both sides, with estimates suggesting that approximately 2.5 million Korean civilians died during the war from direct violence, disease, starvation, and exposure, while millions more were displaced from their homes, separated from family members, and forced to flee as refugees, either within Korea or to neighboring countries. The physical destruction of Korea was near total in many areas, with cities like Seoul, Pyongyang, Inchon, and numerous smaller towns reduced to rubble by bombing and ground combat, industrial facilities destroyed, Transportation infrastructure, including roads, bridges, and railways, devastated. Agricultural production severely disrupted, leading to food shortages and famine conditions in some areas. And the overall economic capacity of both North and South Korea reduced to a fraction of pre-war levels, requiring years of reconstruction and massive foreign assistance to rebuild. The American bombing campaign against North Korea was particularly devastating, with U.S. Air Force and Navy aircraft dropping hundreds of thousands of tons of bombs on North Korean cities, industrial facilities, transportation networks, and military targets. And while military necessity justified many of these attacks, the cumulative effect was to reduce much of North Korea to ruins and create lasting trauma and bitterness in the North Korean population that would shape the regime's ideology and its relationship with the United States for generations. The economic costs of the war for all participants were substantial, with the United States spending approximately $67 billion in 1953 dollars, equivalent to well over $1 trillion in current purchasing power, making it one of the most expensive military operations in American history up to that time. While the war's cost for China and the Soviet Union, who provided military equipment, supplies, and support to North Korea and Chinese forces, were also significant, though precise figures are difficult to determine. Beyond the immediate costs in lives, destruction, and expenditure, the war's long-term consequences have been profound and enduring, including the permanent division of Korea into two states with fundamentally opposed political systems and ideologies, the separation of millions of families who have never been reunited, and many of whose members have died without ever seeing their relatives again, the creation of one of the world's most heavily militarized borders in the demilitarized zone, which, despite its name, is actually bristling with weapons and has been the site of numerous incidents and continued tensions for over 70 years. The consolidation of authoritarian rule in North Korea under Kim Il-sung and his successors, who used the war and the continued state of technical belligerency to justify their repressive policies and militarized society, and the trauma experienced by an entire generation of Koreans, Americans, Chinese, and others who participated in or witnessed the war's violence, and whose lives were forever changed by the experience. The war also had significant political costs, including the intensification of Cold War tensions, the transformation of U.S.-China relations into implacable hostility that would last for more than 2 decades, the militarization of American foreign policy, and the establishment of a permanent American military presence in South Korea and throughout East Asia that continues to this day, and the creation of precedents for American military intervention in conflicts around the world without formal declarations of war, setting patterns that would be repeated in Vietnam and subsequent conflicts. The Korean War's costs thus extended far beyond the immediate casualties and destruction of 1950 to 1953, shaping the entire subsequent history of the Korean Peninsula, influencing Cold War dynamics and American foreign policy for decades, and leaving wounds and divisions that remain unhealed into the 21st century, making it truly one of the most consequential and costly conflicts in modern history, despite its relative obscurity in Western historical consciousness. Long-term impact and the paradox of forgetting. The Korean War's long-term impact on international relations, military strategy, domestic politics, and the lives of millions of people has been profound and enduring. Yet, paradoxically, this enormously consequential conflict has been largely forgotten in Western consciousness, creating a disconnect between the war's actual historical significance and its place in public memory that reveals much about how societies remember and forget their past. The war's most obvious and visible long-term impact is the continued division of the Korean Peninsula into 2 separate states with diametrically opposed political systems, economies, and social structures, a division that has persisted for more than 70 years since the Armistice of July 27, 1953, making it one of the most enduring geopolitical divisions created by the Cold War and the only one that remains essentially unchanged after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the broader Cold War confrontation. North Korea, under the Kim dynasty, has evolved into one of the world's most isolated, repressive, and militarized societies, with a command economy that has produced periodic famines and chronic poverty. While the regime devotes enormous resources to maintaining a massive military and developing nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles that have made North Korea a continuing security threat and diplomatic challenge for the United States, South Korea, Japan, China, and the broader international community. South Korea, by contrast, transformed itself from a war-devastated agrarian society into one of the world's most dynamic and prosperous economies, achieving remarkable industrial development, democratization after decades of authoritarian rule, and emergence as a major technological and cultural power, whose influence extends globally through its electronics, automobiles, popular culture, and soft power, demonstrating that the two Koreas, starting from similar positions in 1953, have followed completely divergent paths based on their different political and economic systems. The demilitarized zone that separates North and South Korea remains one of the most heavily fortified borders in the world, bristling with weapons, mines, and military installations, despite its name suggesting demilitarization. And this border has been the site of numerous incidents over the decades, including firefights, infiltration attempts, tunnels discovered leading under the DMZ, and occasional provocations that have raised tensions and threatened to reignite the conflict that never formally ended, since no peace treaty was ever signed. The separation of families remains one of the war's most tragic ongoing legacies, with millions of Koreans separated from relatives when the peninsula was divided, and many dying without ever seeing or communicating with their family members on the other side. The war's impact on American foreign policy and military strategy was equally significant and long-lasting, as the Korean experience established precedents and patterns that would shape American behavior throughout the Cold War and beyond, including the commitment to maintaining a permanent military presence overseas with bases and forward-deployed forces, the willingness to intervene militarily in regional conflicts seen as part of the broader struggle against communism, or threats to American interests, the use of limited war concepts where military force is employed for specific political objectives rather than total victory, and the practice of fighting wars without formal declarations of war from Congress, relying instead on presidential authority and United Nations resolutions or other legal frameworks. The permanent stationing of American forces in South Korea, initially conceived as temporary, but continuing more than 70 years later, with approximately 28,500 American military personnel still based there, represents one of the most enduring American military commitments anywhere in the world, and symbolizes the ongoing American role in maintaining stability and deterring North Korean aggression in Northeast Asia. Yet despite these enormous and continuing impacts, the Korean War has been largely forgotten in American and Western consciousness, earning its designation as the Forgotten War through a combination of factors that relegated it to marginal status in public memory and popular culture. The war's position between World War II and Vietnam meant it was overshadowed by both, with World War II remaining vivid as the Good War, with clear moral stakes, dramatic moments, and decisive victory, while Vietnam would traumatize American society and dominate cultural production for decades, leaving Korea squeezed between these two more prominent conflicts and struggling for recognition. The inconclusive nature of the war's ending, with an armistice that simply stopped the fighting without resolving the underlying issues or producing victory, made it difficult to commemorate in the triumphalist manner Americans preferred. As there were no ticker-tape parades, no dramatic surrender ceremonies, no sense of accomplishment beyond having prevented South Korea's conquest, and the fact that Korea remained divided, essentially where it had been before the war began, made it seem like 3 years of fighting and tens of thousands of American deaths had achieved nothing. The limited public engagement with the war, compared to World War II, meant that most Americans did not serve in Korea, and did not have the personal connections through family members or friends who served that would have kept the war vivid in their memories, allowing the broader public to move on once the fighting stopped without dwelling on an unsatisfying conflict. The lack of cultural representation through films, novels, television shows, and other media that might have kept the Korean War in public consciousness contributed significantly to its forgetting, as there was no Korean War equivalent to the vast library of World War II films and literature, or the powerful Vietnam War movies that would force engagement with those conflicts. The belated construction of the Korean War Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., which was not dedicated until 1995, more than 4 decades after the armistice, symbolized the neglect of the war and the long struggle of veterans for recognition. The forgetting of the Korean War thus represents a particularly Western and especially American phenomenon, reflecting the tendency to remember wars selectively based on whether they produced satisfying narratives, clear victories, dramatic moments suitable for commemoration, and outcomes that justified the sacrifices made. And when wars failed to meet these criteria, as Korea did with its stalemated conclusion and continuing unresolved division, they fade from consciousness even when their actual impacts are enormous and enduring, making the challenge to rescue this conflict from forgotten status essential to comprehending contemporary geopolitics in East Asia and the patterns of limited war that continue to influence how nations employ military force in the modern world. Conclusion. The Korean War killed millions, devastated an entire peninsula, and permanently divided a nation, yet remains inadequately remembered despite its profound consequences. This conflict transformed U.S.-China relations into decades of hostility, established American limited war precedents, and created the ongoing North Korean nuclear crisis, threatening regional stability today. The war's frustrating stalemate, ending essentially where it began after 3 years of combat, demonstrated military power's limitations against determined adversaries and contributed to its marginalization in American memory. The Korean War's legacy persists powerfully in the divided peninsula, militarized DMZ, separated families, and alliance structures shaping East Asian security. The designation Forgotten War reflects not the conflict's lack of importance, but Western society's selective memory favoring wars with clear victories over those ending in unresolved stalemate. The time has come to rescue this war from obscurity. Subscribe to our channel to explore more forgotten Cold War history that shaped our modern world. Like this video if you believe these stories deserve remembrance. And share your thoughts in the comments. Do you think the Korean War receives adequate recognition today? Share this video with students, educators, and history enthusiasts to ensure these vital lessons reach future generations. Together, we can preserve the memory of those who served and suffered while applying these lessons to prevent similar unresolved conflicts.